Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Today is October the 16th, 2022, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, world history, you name it, we'll talk about it, unless it's TOS. Without further ado, I will join voice chat with my good friend Agent Smith, and we will discuss what the heck is going on. Hello?
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing okay.
That is good.
Well,
How's the what?
well, you were going to like a thing last week?
Yes, I went to a thing called TwitchCon.
Ah, gotcha.
Yeah, San Diego. I got
Did you-
to do a little tour after the event as well, which you probably would find amusing. I went to the USS Midway.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Massive battleship. Holy crap. I'd never been on an aircraft carrier before. But you're up on it, and it's so huge that it's kind of like just being on another city street, but you're actually on a boat. And
Yeah.
the thing is in amazing condition. And I think the battle record for that ship and a few other ships that it had listed on plaques and stuff were they were pretty much undefeated. But I think carriers, they're more of like out in the open sea, and then planes can fly off of them and do stuff, but they don't really like get right into the shit most of the time.
Yeah, they're not very good at melee.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're kind of vulnerable to that. Well, hypothetically, I guess they could, but they have a carrier battle group basically that they're attached to,
Mm-hmm.
which is specifically designed to give them lots of protection.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible, but in general, you want to keep them away from danger,
Mm-hmm.
preferably. Yeah, the carrier battle group is more designed to defend against any attacks that do manage to find them.
Mm-hmm.
But preferably, you make it relatively hard to find them in the first place so that you don't have to worry about it.
How do you hide something so big?
I don't know, the ocean's even bigger.
That's
Lo-
fair.
Lots of places to hide. Yeah, it can be done for sure.
Put it in the
Yeah,
Pacific.
yeah. In the Pacific in particular, there's lots of places that you can not be. So that makes it hard to figure out where you are. Yeah, if they do find you, it's probably because of some intelligence thing. Like there was a guy in the Navy who sold secrets to the Soviets in the 1980s, and he basically just gave them the locations of all of the US's carriers.
Hmm.
So in the event of World War III, they might not have lasted very long just on account of that. But assuming your counterintelligence is doing its job, it should be a secret for the most part as to just exactly where they are at a given time.
Mm-hmm. Chad saying a carrier strike group is 2 subs, 3 destroyers, and a carrier.
I think it's more than that, but I would defer to Chad on that. I don't know exactly. They're pretty large. You need units to provide air defense, surface-to-surface defense, anti-sub defense, basically any contingency you can think of.
Mm-hmm. We also
They're
saw the
very
little
expensive.
catapult things where they launch planes off of. It's pretty
Hmm.
crazy that the runway on the aircraft carrier isn't enough for the planes to just get their own momentum by rolling their wheels and driving off. They need to be launched with the catapult system. And there was a little video where they were talking about how all that works and all the stuff the flight crew have to do of like making sure they do their job at hooking everything up and then signaling to the other people to do things. And then when a plane lands on the carrier, they also have to be hooked back in and then slowed down. So it's both to give them momentum to speed up and then stopping their momentum whenever they land on it.
Yeah, it's a very challenging job.
Mm-hmm.
It's never risk-free, taking off or especially landing on a carrier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my grandfather was naval aviation during Vietnam, so he always had lots of stories about it. The way he told it, night landings in particular on a carrier are quite fraught.
Yeah.
It's very tricky. You kind of have to rely on basically the way they used to do it. I don't know if they still do this, but back in the day, what they would do is that they would have a guy on the carrier and he would have a signaling system. And basically, the way it would work is it would use lights to try to signal whether the aircraft needed to get higher or needed to go lower so that they could land at just the right place on the carrier's deck. to get the whatchamacallit, the line that they had out.
Mm.
Yeah, if you go too low, then you crash into the back of the carrier. That's not good.
Yeah.
But if you go too high, then there's a chance you miss the deck entirely and then just crash into the ocean ahead of the carrier, which is also not good. So either way, you really need to kind of thread the needle and just land right at the right angle and the right place in order to make it happen. And yeah, again, without being able to see the carrier, which is generally the case at night, that's an even more difficult process than it normally is.
Hmm. They showcased a lot of different planes on the carrier as well. Some of them were actually planes that could have been on the ship during World War II, and then some were more modern, like they had the plane that was really common in the Top Gun movies and stuff. So pretty cool range of stuff. Lots of helicopters as well, and they let you get up and sit in the cockpits of some of them. And it was cool seeing like the really old school uh, cockpits for these planes where the dials were all analog, like stuff wasn't digital yet. There were
Yeah.
little dials that would flip around and you had to look at those and stuff, and you also didn't have all the fancy radar and things that they have now. So a lot of it was more about, can you see where you're going just visually and then handle that.
Yeah, back in the day, it was a lot more busy in terms of the visual representation of data
Mm-hmm.
in a cockpit. It was pretty tricky, but you could still just fly by your instruments.
Mm-hmm.
Even how relatively unsophisticated they may have been, you were still required as a pilot to learn how to fly, relying only on them.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to night flying in particular, even if you're not a naval aviator, night flying is still pretty risky because you can't exactly see where the horizon is. So that could make it relatively easy to suffer from vertigo, which
Mm-hmm.
is very bad news if you're a pilot. It can feel like you're declining when you're not, or that you're even when you're declining,
Mm-hmm.
or descending rather. So in either case, you need to be able to fly based off of the information you're getting from the instruments. And so, even with the lack of digital data, the lack of digital instruments that they had back then, they could still do that.
Mm-hmm.
It was still pretty workable, just a little more challenging, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
And they did still have some pretty cool tech back then. I remember what was it? The F-86 Sabre, which was a fighter in the Korean War, actually had a what was it? It was a kind of I guess it's what the kids would call today an aimbot, but basically it was like this little thing. Are you familiar with a heads-up display?
Yep.
Yeah, so what they would do is they would project an image onto the HUD system, and it would show you where to point your aircraft in order to hit the target that you were trying to shoot down.
Mm-hmm.
Mind you, they didn't really have missiles so much back then. Everything was still done by gun. But they actually had rudimentary radar and a rudimentary computer system on board that would actually allow them to uh, provide a visual aid to the pilot to help them lead the target so that they could, better shoot down whoever it was that they were dogfighting with.
Cool.
So not bad for the 1950s. Got to give them credit.
Were the opponents of these people complaining about hacking at the time?
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think Russians were quite so prominent on the internet at the time.
Hmm.
Well, maybe I should say North Koreans. It was the Korean War. Although there were some Russian pilots in the first year of the war. They were pretty cagey about that. Yeah, they were very risk averse even then. There was even some incidents where some Russian pilots who were downed and ejected were killed by their own people in order to prevent them from being captured by the US so that they would maintain plausible deniability about Soviet involvement.
Damn. They just shoot down their own pilots?
Yeah, the one incident that I remember specifically, there was a Russian pilot, or most likely a Russian pilot. I guess we can't entirely prove it, but he had been shot down, ejected, and he was in the water. I don't remember exactly where. He was in the ocean near Korea somewhere. And before the U.S. could get to him, some Russian slash North Korean aircraft came by and strafed him and killed him.
Hmm. Damn.
Yeah, they weren't willing to take the risk. They didn't know what the U.S. would do if they were able to prove definitively that Russian pilots were flying in the war.
Hmm.
It was already a pretty tense situation, especially with Douglas MacArthur running around trying to nuke anybody and everybody. So I can't really blame them for being risk averse on that count.
Yeah. But yeah, the Midway was really cool. We also got to see the captain's quarter, admiral's quarters, I guess is what it's technically called, and how it's like you're in this very bare bones, everything is about utility ship environment, and then you get to the admiral's quarters and it's like a heckin' nice living room, and they've got a little chef's area next to it so they can eat whatever they want to, kind of a thing. Well, not whatever,
Hmm.
but food is prepared there. We didn't get to see the command center kind of thing, just limited by time. But the place is so big, they actually recommended taking 2 days to see all of it, 2 to 3 days, depending on the pace that you take going through it. Just a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah. What class of carrier was that?
Uh, don't quite recall exactly. Could
Oh.
be looked up.
The newer ones we have are probably bigger if it was a World War II carrier.
Yeah, they did
Well,
have a kind of model of some of the more recent carrier ships and how many more planes it could hold and stuff than this old-timey one.
yeah,
But the condition
yeah,
of this
they're
one was really impressive. It looked really clean and in really good shape, like it could go into action if it needed to.
hmm, I don't know if they'd be able to fit too much modern on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the planes are a lot bigger than they used to be. Yeah, it can be done. I remember they were able to make the A5 work, even though that was a beast of a plane.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was, well, I think the largest plane that ever managed to land and take off from a carrier was actually a C-130,
Mm-hmm.
as crazy as that is. That's not really supposed to do that.
Is that a bomber?
It's a big cargo plane, a big
Oh.
four-engine cargo plane. Not the biggest, but medium-sized.
Mm-hmm.
If you looked at it, you wouldn't think it was really carrier worthy, but they were at least able to make one do it.
Mm-hmm.
So full credit. Yeah, interesting trivia, maybe it doesn't bear repeating, but one of the things aspects, I guess, that distinguishes carrier-worthy aircraft is that they have reinforced carriages.
Mm-hmm.
The wheels on which the aircraft rests on. When you're landing on a carrier, you generally land pretty roughly, and so you have to have reinforced superstructure there where the wheels are, so that they don't just break when you land, or especially after repeated landings, which kind of builds up the wear and tear over time.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you generally don't see Air Force aircraft like F-16s and stuff landing on carriers. They don't really have the specialized landing gear necessary for that. It would probably suffer some kind of structural break of some kind. Well, I was going to ask you, you were at TwitchCon, right?
Yep.
So did you see the ball pit thing?
Yes, I did. I was actually saved by the long line. I thought about,
Really?
yeah, I thought about doing it because it looked pretty funny. And yeah, it turns out it wasn't really up to snuff in terms of safety. It was a very shallow
Yeah,
foam pit kind of a thing. So whoever was in charge of that probably could have done a little bit more diligence there.
or a lot more.
Yeah, true.
It looked pretty painful to me.
Yeah.
I think you dodged a bullet then.
Yep, that was the thing that people ended up talking about for this year's TwitchCon. There's always something. Some years it's the line. Other years it's something like this, where it's one of the, I think it was one of the companies there, they had that set up. And people got to do that if they chose to. I opted not to, but I had a good time overall. They had a really cool arcade area, which was good for just starting conversation and meeting new people and that kind of a thing. There are lots of different types of streamers. I think a lot of times you get stuck in your own bubble where you hang out with other people who are in the same category as yourself, and you don't really meet people who stream something that's maybe very different from what you stream. That was cool. I met a like medieval role-playing streamer where he's like some kind of king, and he has people on a show sort of like it's Dungeons and Dragons, but it's not like role-based and stat-based in the same way. So that was cool. A lot of people who have like interesting outfits and stuff, or they cosplay as something. So it was a refreshing time to expand my horizons and see lots of different stuff. The King guy, yeah, the King guy came up to myself and my partner, and they wanted her to be on their show sometime. She had elf ears on and some really awesome makeup and stuff, so they figured that would be a good match for their sort of show and content and stuff.
Oh, neat. It sounds like you had a good time.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any particular news item you wanted to get to here today?
Yeah, I asked chat ahead of time, and there are a couple of them. One of them was the recommendation. I guess Xi Jinping did a speech, and there's probably some stuff there that might be substantive, but as we've talked about many times, talk is cheap, and a lot of people talk shit to build clout or to make their country look strong or whatever, that kind of a thing. But one of the specific items was recommending that Chinese citizens leave Ukraine, and I think some other countries who are Russian allies in all of this were also recommending that, which I was kind of surprised, because I would have thought that would have happened as soon as the war broke out, that they would recommend people leave. But some people were speculating that that might be a sign of escalation in the future. But if it is, then that's a pretty obvious sign, which removes your element of surprise.
I think it's more of a delayed reaction. I think a lot of countries with close relations with Russia were willing to kind of give Russia the benefit of the doubt that it would be a short, victorious war. And there was a sense that if they, told their citizens to evacuate, that would be a sort of way of doubting the Russian claim that it would be such, that it would be relatively quick, and that their nationals would not be in any danger. India kind of had a similar problem at the start of the conflict. There was a sense that their nationals should leave, but I don't think the government really told them they needed to at the start. So since then, not only has the war proven to be a long war, but it hasn't been one that's gone particularly well for Russia. And a number of countries that Russia has influence over, specifically in its near abroad, like states in Central Asia and the Caucasus, have grown increasingly bold in their criticism of the Russian government and its little adventure in Ukraine. So at this point, the Russian ability to exert influence over these countries has sufficiently weakened that they're willing to take actions that the Russian state does not particularly like, but cannot really at this point deter. And among them involves, telling their citizens that you should probably leave Ukraine. So I wouldn't read too much into it as far as any kind of indication of escalation pending. Even if the Russians were planning on escalating, I doubt they would tell anybody, basically, up to and including nominally allied states. They would probably prefer to keep it to themselves.
Yeah, telegraphing your attacks is usually a bad idea, because it gives them more time to prepare.
Exactly. I don't think they really care what they think anyway. I mean, what's Kyrgyzstan going to do to them? Not much.
There was also a question about some strikes within Russia. I'm kind of wondering what the state of that is. Have there been any offensives from Ukraine, or is it people kind of against the war within Russia?
I don't think there's really been a lot of traction there. There was some stuff blowing up in Belgorod again, but that's kind of a recurring phenomena at this point.
Stuff just blows up there.
Well, Whether it's the Ukrainians or saboteurs within Russia is debatable.
Mm.
Some of them have been attributed to the Ukrainians, but there's probably some arson going on by locals as well. It's just a little hard to tell.
Mm.
But yeah, I don't think that, well, there's also been some strikes in Crimea, I guess, but Crimea's status is disputed, so that almost doesn't count as strikes within Russia. But other than that, there hasn't been a whole lot going on within Russia as far as things like airstrikes or Ukrainian sabotage. There has been escalating sabotage by locals. There's been a lot of people setting fire to recruitment centers and some sabotage in other areas, like industry. But nothing beyond the, well, nothing unusually great, nothing beyond the norm, basically, at this point.
Mm.
At least nothing that I've noticed in particular. There has been more talk about nuclear weapons being used.
Mm.
I've seen some of that talked about. The Russian government has kind of referred to that repeatedly as their go-to threat
Mm.
whenever they're feeling particularly put upon.
Yeah, if I had $1 every time I read a headline that said Russia warns, I would have so many dollars that I could actually fly to go see you and just buy you a house.
Yeah, yeah, they've been doing that a lot. But, as we've seen with North Korea, when you don't have a lot else to work with, you kind of resort to threats.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes your go-to. Yeah, I mean, I did read some interesting analysis, I think, the past week that suggested that maybe they actually would use nuclear weapons, but maybe not for the reason you might think. And I thought it was a pretty interesting point that I hadn't really considered before. People talk about Russia using nuclear weapons as a way to basically win the war. They're going to try to break the deadlock in the war using tactical nuclear weapons to try to throw back the Ukrainian army, and then rely on strategic nuclear threats in order to try to deter Western intervention, or at least a substantive Western response. I don't think that if they use nukes, it'll be for that reason. I think, based off of the analysis I read anyway, the opinion that I read, that they would use it to try to draw in the West more into the conflict so that the Russian government could more credibly claim in Russian politics that it's fighting the West and not with Ukraine.
Right.
And the idea there is that it's less embarrassing for the Russian government in terms of domestic Russian politics to lose a war against the West than it is to lose a war against Ukraine.
Yeah.
So this particular analyst made the argument that Russia might use nuclear weapons in a limited capacity just to try to goad the West into retaliating to some degree so that Moscow could say that the West was intervening in the conflict and that the Russian army, well, that the Russian government should not be blamed for the war going badly, because in point of fact, they're just overmatched by all of these powerful Western nations conspiring against them.
Mm-hmm.
So that would not really change the outcome of the war, one way or the other, but it would help preserve, relatively speaking, the legitimacy of the Russian state in the eyes of the Russian public.
Mm-hmm.
So goes the analysis anyway. This is a guy named Kamil Galiyev, who's a Russian analyst, technically an ethnic Tatar, but still Russian, and he's been one of the more prolific posters on Twitter. He's not a Twitter guy per se. He's actually a think tanker. He's an analyst who works for the Wilson Institute, but he's been commenting a lot on the war in Ukraine, and he's been pretty spot on thus far. And he's also posted a lot of really cool historical stuff to try to add context to the conflict. So he's one of my preferred reads as far as commentary on the war, at least thus far. So I thought it was a pretty cool take. Well, I mean, an interesting take. Maybe I should rephrase that. It was a really interesting take, and I think there's more credence to that perspective than there is to some of the, other perspectives that kind of cry havoc and, call for Armageddon.
Mm-hmm.
This is a more practical interpretation of how nuclear weapons might be used that kind of incorporates rather the context of Russian politics. So that seems relatively more likely. I still don't think overall the Russian government will use nukes. I think overall it's just too risky for them. But I could see a kind of path forward where they might, according to this particular line of reasoning anyway. But I don't think they're just going to go, balls out and just start throwing around nukes in a desperate bid to win the war and turn things around. That doesn't seem particularly likely to me.
Yeah, that would basically cause them to throw out their card of we're just doing an operation to help the Russian people in Ukraine who actually want to be part of Russia. Like they're going into it with this pretense, and if you're continuing to escalate, you're basically making that more and more obvious that you're bullshitting people.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how much they would necessarily care if people know they're bullshitting. I mean, I think pretty much everybody in Russia and outside knows at this point.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that some people within Russia don't particularly care about the bullshitting. They want the war to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who don't want it are not particularly in power right now. Russia is not a representative political system. So there's not much they can do about it.
Yeah, I feel like I can understand the general desire for your country to be like badass, to be strong, to be successful, to be like the hero of the world and that kind of stuff, but how complex the world stage is and how that's basically always an oversimplification. So if you get overly hyped up and like stuck on the national pride, it can cause you to fail to see a lot of the mistakes that your country's making, a lot of the wasted spending and stuff like that. It's good to be critical of your country as well as to be proud of your country. If your country's doing some messed up stuff, well, you can stand against it. Russia's making it kind of dicey to do so. It seemed like gradually over the course of the conflict, people have been able to represent more and more kind of criticism in various ways. I don't know if people are still being killed and stuff or falling out of windows or whatever the excuses are.
Well, mobilization has continued to pace, and I was reading today it probably will be more than the, what was it, 300K or so that was originally outlined. It's more likely to be around 500K, it seems. And it seems the Russian government has also gotten more bold in terms of its recruitment methods. I don't know if it's necessarily directed by the centralized Russian state, but at the very least, local recruiters are getting more and more aggressive about pulling people off of the street who might not necessarily fall under the original eligibility rules outlined in the original announcement for mobilization. So, yeah, there's more resistance. There is arson, sabotage, what have you, but the government is kind of responding to that with greater mobilization, greater censorship, greater crackdowns generally, basically. But I don't know that they're necessarily using violence per se. I haven't heard too much about people, being killed or, even necessarily beaten, or at least no more so than usual anyway. So that doesn't necessarily seem to be the key response here. I think overall the Russian government probably feels relatively safe in terms of domestic unrest. I think overall it's been within pretty manageable bounds for them thus far. So I think in so much as they're concerned about political instability, it's more so to do with infighting within the government rather than amongst people outside of government. There has been some instability in that regard, as far as elites being more open and maneuvering against each other for power within Putin's patronage network. And also Kadyrov making noise about, potential, well, not separatism per se, but anything Kadyrov says that's critical of the Russian government always has the subtext of separatism, giving his background and the context of his rise to power. So that's more, I think, what the Russian government is probably focusing on at this juncture, at least as far as domestic issues.
He's the propaganda guy, right?
Kadyrov? No, he's what would it be? Governor, I guess, of Chechnya.
Oh, yes, that guy.
Yeah, son of the former rebel leader. Is de facto warlord of Chechnya at this point. He basically runs it as his personal fiefdom, but in exchange, he has to maintain loyalty to Moscow. That's the little quid pro quo they set up after the Chechen wars ended, or at least, well, maybe not when they ended per se, but That was one of the deals that helped contribute to the end of the Chechen Wars anyway. Well, another problem with Russian nationalists is that they really think of themselves as realists. And realists tend to focus a lot on national security, specifically in military terms.
Hmm.
And the result is that they have a very sort of stark perspective of international relations, which is very suspicious and paranoid and does not leave a lot of room for cooperation or negotiation or what have you. You know, the perspective that I've heard it described as assuming that peace is a period between wars rather than wars being an interruption of periods between peace.
Hmm.
So that kind of mindset kind of lends itself to a degree of militarism and skepticism, if not cynicism, that just inherently inherently lends itself to military solutions to problems like this.
Hmm.
And it's also lent itself to greater centralization of government, more authoritarianism, you know, etc. I mean, the whole sort of Chekist worldview is very much of that mind. And that just makes it hard for the war to conclude any other way but through violence. You know, there's just, they don't trust the West, like in any way. And
Hmm.
in so much as there's been criticism of the government in Russia, the most impactful criticism has actually come from them, you know, not from the anti-government liberals. You know, the nationalists think the government isn't going far enough in the war effort and they want it to expand the war effort. You know, broader mobilization, more resources, you know, more escalation. I mean, just anything and everything that would be required for Russia to win, they think the Russian government should be doing,
Hmm.
and that it should not be pulling its punches quite so much. They also complain a lot about the quality of the leadership in theater. You know, all of the things that the West has criticized the Russian military for doing in Ukraine, beyond just the invasion itself, but also in terms of the low quality of the day-to-day military operations conducted by the Russian military. That's all stuff that Russian nationalists online complain about too, and they think the Russian government isn't doing enough to fix it.
Hmm.
So that criticism means a lot more to Moscow than criticism from, you know, college liberals who want more representative government, less corruption, what have you. You know, those are not their constituents. Their real constituents are the nationalists.
Hmm.
And so those complaints have resulted in relatively more of a response from Moscow than you would see from other groups.
That makes sense. You care more about your internal opinions than the external ones, because that's some of the power of your base that you want to maintain.
Let's see, since we're on the topic of Ukraine here, I could kind of just get through some of the other items if you're okay with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you hear about the bridge over the Kerch Strait?
Mm, no.
It was something that happened last week. That was, are you familiar with the Kerch Strait?
Is that the one near the city that's like really crucial for going in and out in one of the directions? I don't know if we've talked about this before.
Well, are you familiar with Crimea?
Yes.
So the eastern part of Crimea is actually really close to Russia proper.
Uh-huh.
And so Russia built a bridge connecting Russia with eastern Crimea. So that's the Kerch Strait, and that's the bridge that they built over it.
Mm-hmm.
And people online have kind of been wondering, you know, if and when the Ukrainians might try to disable the bridge in order to complicate Russian logistics, you know, because Russian troops in the south of Ukraine are supplied through Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could destroy that bridge, that would make it more difficult to get supplies to units there.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians had said that the defenses around the bridge and the security for the bridge were sufficient to prevent that from happening. But then last week, it happened. You know, there was an explosion, and one of the what was it? One of the lanes was collapsed. There's still a lane open. You can still drive over it, but now there's just half the lanes available. And also the rail track was damaged. You know, basically the bridge is actually three separate bridges. There's one lane going one way, a lane going the other way, and then a rail bridge. So the rail bridge was damaged, and then one of the other lane bridges collapsed. It was made worse by the fact that the bomb went off when there was a train full of, what would you call them, oil cars, I guess, that was set alight by the explosion. It caused even more damage. So the bridge has not been completely dismantled, but the capacity of goods that can be carried across it has been fairly significantly reduced, at least until it can be sufficiently repaired to allow a resumption of traffic. So that was a pretty notable event last week. It's not going to win the war or anything, but
Hmm.
a pretty notable event that the Ukrainians were able to finally, strike it. The Russians were not too happy about it. They retaliated with a series of airstrikes in Ukraine. Well, maybe not airstrike, but missile strikes. They launched a volley of, I guess, what would have been cruise missiles of one sort or another into Ukraine and ended up destroying something like two-thirds of Ukraine's energy infrastructure in the immediate days after the attack on the bridge. So there was some scrambling to try to ensure the supply of electricity to Ukraine. That barrage has since stopped. They were only able to do it for a couple days, or maybe only wanted to do it for a couple days. But regardless, they did a fair amount of damage.
I heard that was about messing it up for the cold winter and stuff. They won't be able to have heat and stuff.
Yeah, that's part of it, but more specifically, it was a response to the bridge.
Mm.
There's not really much of a military need per se to respond to an attack on the bridge like that, but politically there was. The Russian
Hmm.
government periodically is embarrassed whenever a large attack is carried out within its claimed territory.
Hmm.
And so it feels the need to respond in some way in order to appease the nationalists who invariably are upset by it. There was something similar with the Moskva, that big, well, it was actually the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. When that was sunk by the Ukrainians, there was a big outcry by Russian nationalists, and so the government had to retaliate by launching some airstrikes in order to try to appease them. So similar phenomena here. Let's see, we already talked about that. Had you heard about the gas minimum that was being discussed in Europe?
No, what's that?
Well, the idea is that the European Union wants to negotiate a minimum price at which people will buy Russian natural gas. They would prefer to ban it outright, but instead they're going to try to limit the price that they pay for it. They're kind of already on fixed contracts right now, so that can't necessarily change unless they want to override them. And they're already trying to limit purchases of natural gas. And of course, the Russians have basically cut them off from natural gas, so to a degree, it's kind of a moot point anyway. But the idea is to try to extend the minimum natural gas price to the rest of the world as much as possible. That's not going to be particularly possible, so it's not saying much, but they are going to make the effort. I was kind of curious how they would do this because they've been talking about this off and on for several months, and it kind of felt more like a symbolic thing that wasn't actually going to impact anything. But they were talking more about it last week, and apparently the way they're going to operationalize it is that they're going to require services firms, basically commodities traders, financiers, insurers, basically services sector firms of one sort or another. They're going to prohibit them from doing any kind of business with Russia unless, well, specifically, they're going to prohibit them from doing any kind of business with Russian natural gas unless the price that natural gas is being sold at is at or below the minimum that the European Union has decided upon. So this isn't really so much a price minimum. This is actually going to be more of a sanction, a new kind of sanction that is going to limit the ability for Gazprom, Russia's natural gas, state-owned natural gas firm, from receiving the benefit of business from, its insurers and finance firms, lawyers, etc., unless it sells its natural gas at a predetermined minimum. Uh, that makes more sense than just saying that the European Union wants everybody around the world to just buy at a certain price. Everybody was going to invariably ignore that. But if European traders do not facilitate deals involving natural gas unless that price is below a certain threshold. That makes it relatively more likely. I still don't think it'll really work. I kind of suspect that, countries that want to buy from Russia, and certainly Russia, which wants to sell it, is just going to lie about the price in order to get around any rules that are set in this vein. And then they'll find just other ways to compensate each other in order to try to get around it. Even if they do sell at the minimum price, basically the buyers will find other ways to give the Russians additional value in some way in order to kind of in order to reach that market price. Basically, it's just going to be difficult to enforce, regardless of how they do it.
People are asking why is it a minimum when it sounds like a maximum?
Why is it a minimum when it
Because
sounds
they
like a
can't
maximum?
exceed a certain amount.
Well, maybe you're right. Maybe I'm getting a price ceiling. Yeah, it would be a price ceiling, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
That's my mistake. My apologies. They're trying to actually impose a price ceiling. There we go.
Yeah, so it doesn't get way too expensive.
Well, it's not about getting too expensive. I mean, it is expensive, but it's more about trying to reduce Russian gas revenues because natural gas revenues are one of their biggest sources of revenue over there.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, all of that money is being used. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it is going to be used in relation to the war in Ukraine. So any dollars that are taken away from the Russian government's coffers are dollars that are not going to be used against the Ukrainian state. Hence the interest in trying to minimize them.
Mm-hmm.
Price ceiling. I'm getting old, Neuro. Just my brain doesn't want to cooperate anymore.
I just turned 33 6 days ago, so I'm getting up there. You're how many years older than me, if you feel comfortable saying?
Three? 36 now?
Nice.
I think anyway. The older you get, the less you really care about keeping track of your age.
Mm-hmm.
It ceases to have positive connotations beyond a certain threshold.
Yeah, we're just in the 30s range now. Who cares? Someone was asking, what is the name of the Russian analyst game theorist? They missed the name.
What was his name? Gamil Khalid. I actually got it bookmarked, so let me look it up for you. Am I getting his name wrong again? Kamil Galeev. There it is. I can post a link to the Twitter for you. I'm always getting the first letters of his first and last name confused. There you go.
There's the Twitter. Posted it in the chat.
But other than that, all I had on Ukraine was just incremental changes on the ground. I don't think there's been any of the big sweeping moves that we'd seen before.
Mm-hmm.
So slow, steady advances in sort of the south and Kherson and also in the east. And it's just sort of in a grinding, slow phase right now.
Yeah, I did see some pictures as well of different groups of Ukrainian troops and stuff getting trained in the UK and getting trained in France, and how training seems to be a really important part of this whole process of making sure the troops actually have an impact. Like they
Yeah,
throw around the 300,000 in terms of mobilization, but if you're mobilizing bad troops, then that's just going to be bad for those troops, and you're not really going to gain too much ground.
exactly. Yeah,
It,
they're just gonna, I mean, the suspicion is that they're just going to be throwing people into a meat grinder and that it's not going to be impactful at all.
mm-hmm.
They're not going to be like top rate troops. And
Yeah.
what top rate troops they've had have been just pilloried. They've just been gutted by the fighting over the past couple months. So it's not clear just what they have left that can really make a difference in the conflict. Ukraine kind of has a similar problem. Ukraine also has been mobilizing conscripts who don't necessarily have much military experience, but they still have that core of their army that was developed after 2014 available. It's taken some losses for sure, but uh, they're still holding up pretty well overall.
Mm.
And of course, even the conscripts are much better motivated than Russian conscripts for obvious reasons.
Yeah, the moral factor.
So that's been a pretty sizable difference maker
Hmm.
to the outcomes thus far.
Equipment quality too, and that's one of the reasons why it feels like escalation beyond what Russia's already doing seems like a bad idea, because then other countries are going to want to up the support level as well.
Mhm.
And Ukraine is either getting some second generation stuff from countries or some pretty new equipment that's just really hard to deal with if you're using old Soviet stuff. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. Chat asks just generally what you think the outcome of the war is going to be. That's kind of a big question. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's still a long way from being finished, barring any further surprises. There's
Mm.
been plenty of surprises thus far, so maybe it's not entirely correct to just assume there won't be any more. Maybe there probably will be to some degree, but
Hmm.
in general, the trajectory of the conflict is such that Ukraine seems to have momentum, and Russia seems to be just kind of struggling to try to find footing and to defend just what it's already taken.
Hmm.
Uh, But both have their advantages and disadvantages. Russia still has the advantage of size,
Hmm.
and it's still making pretty good money on the commodities market, exporting oil and natural gas. They've been able to try to scrounge up resources from places like Iran. They were able to buy a bunch of drones from there. So even if they haven't necessarily been able to maintain the drones they have been able to get some. And China's probably providing some kind of assistance somehow. They're probably doing it very quietly. And it's probably not really sufficient for what Russia needs, certainly not what they would want. But I imagine that they're doing something somewhere. So Russia does have those advantages at least. And then Ukraine, for its part, has the disadvantage of, for one, its economy is not doing well. It's suffering from a collapse in production and also just very high inflation. They do have the benefit of a great deal of financial assistance from the West, but the more expansive that assistance becomes, and it's going to become very expensive over time, the harder it's going to be to maintain public support. So there is something, maybe not a race against the clock per se. I think overall people would still be pretty sympathetic to Ukraine. But, if there's a recession in the US or the West in general, that's going to put on more pressure. That could result in relatively less aid than there would be otherwise.
Hmm.
So that could put a crunch on conditions in Ukraine as far as the government's tax revenue and general conditions. So, it's still up in the air. Ukraine has done very well overall, especially in the opening of the war, and then over the past month or so, with the offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv. But the Russians aren't going to quit anytime soon, near as we can tell. Again, barring surprises. And so that means that it's going to be a slugfest for probably well, I would go so far as to say at least another year, I would guess, because it'll probably take at least that long for the mobilization to fully shake out. I don't think this will be the last mobilization for Russia. They're probably going to keep sending them over time.
Hmm.
So Ukraine is going to continue mobilizing for its part as well. I think they were not able to mobilize like all of the men available. It takes time. Even if you're just trying to mobilize people as quickly as you can, there's a limit to how many people you can realistically train and equip.
Hmm.
So there's still more people left that Ukraine can kind of throw out there. So I suspect they're going to keep mobilizing as well. Yeah, they do have the advantage of having mobilized first, so they do have something of a time advantage in that regard, and a quantitative advantage, although they're still outnumbered. But they'll probably keep that up as well. So to a degree, it's going to come down more to the resilience of the Russians and their ability to kind of replace losses, not only human losses, but equipment, and to try to supply the forces that they've deployed out in Ukraine. And then on the Ukrainian side, it's going to come down to not only their own ability to continue to have enough forces in the field to hold the line or maybe even take territory, but also supplies from the West. If the West can significantly ramp up production and aid, that would significantly help them. But we're kind of bottlenecking right now as far as support to Ukraine. There's a limit to how much the West can realistically supply right now. Because, the whole thing is just very unexpected, if not unprecedented. The way that modern wars in the 21st century, especially modern industrial wars, were supposed to look, uh, was not this. We were not expecting to have to mass produce artillery shells and ammunition and these other sort of ammunition and equipment and whatnot that you would have expected to have to do in like World War II, in an older generation of warfare, but we were not expecting to have to do that now. And so the result is that the heavy industry necessary to produce that stuff is a little bit wanting right now.
Mm-hmm.
It can't really produce enough to meet demand. And so we're having to scale that up, and that's just going to take time. So I don't know that Ukraine can realistically kick the Russians out before we're able to ramp up foreign aid.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's going to take like a year to build all the new factories and hire all the new people and get the supply chains rolling, to full effect. So it's going to come down to who can kind of outlast the other in that regard. Can Ukraine hold on until they can get the foreign aid that they really need to kind of break out? And can the Russians hold on to the territory they've taken, or maybe even mobilize enough people to really change the trajectory of the war? All of that is just open variables, and I'm not an expert either. Actually, that's a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I'm more economics, foreign policy-ish. So, if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. So, I will see comments and whatnot. Feedback is definitely one of the things I get out of this, but I'm not an expert on the war in Ukraine or war in general or any of that. So the stuff I'm talking about here is just stuff that I've read. It's not meant to be like an authoritative account of the conflict or anything. I'm just trying to give you sort of the best that I've read on the subject matter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for being honest and upfront about your ignorance, for we all have ignorance in larger amounts than we might like to admit sometimes.
Yeah. So I, in particular, am not in a position to really answer that question as to what's going to happen. Uh, but I don't know at the same time that really anybody is. Like, it's still very variable. Ukraine definitely has the inside track at this point. I think in general, most of the analysis I've read has kind of assumed that Ukraine can win just by holding on, and that will be possible so long as they have Western support.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that means retaking the territory they've lost or not is still kind of an open question. There'd been a lot of debate about that. The Kharkiv offensive and the Kherson offensive kind of suggested that it was possible, but it's also true that the Russians can rally and maybe take some of that territory back, and that the general balance of power in Ukraine can shift over the coming months or even the next year. So again, don't know. It's anybody's guess right now. In general, I think we can, well, that is to say, the West and Ukraine can eke out a victory of some kind if they just have perseverance. Overall, Russia really does not have enough industry or economic heft or a strong enough military or strong enough logistics or just any number of other variables that they would need to be strong are just not strong in order to really win out in this conflict that they have gotten themselves into.
I
So
guess
most likely, go
that
ahead.
leads into another question, which is pretty similar. There's someone from, where is it? Bulgaria, who was asking if you think that Putin invading Ukraine was a mistake. And then they're also saying that the U.S. was politically separated from Europe with Trump and COVID, but with the West and Europe and the war, like they became more tied and on the same page with stuff because of the invasion. And they're asking if Bulgaria might get involved at some point.
Well, as far as the first question, It was the invasion of Ukraine, by Russia was not a mistake, but it was a miscalculation. Saying it was a mistake implies they didn't do it on purpose, and they definitely did.
Hmm.
So that was very much a purposeful effort on their part. But it was a miscalculation in so much as they assumed that the Western response would be relatively muted. And I've read, analysis on that count as well, that makes the argument that, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was fairly predictable in the sense that they weren't necessarily doing anything they had not done before. They'd attacked Georgia before, although in somewhat different circumstances, but they'd also attacked Ukraine before. And they'd propped up all these little separatist republics around there near abroad, Abkhazia, what was the other one? South Ossetia, Transdniester Republic, so, and then of course the separatist Donbass republics, and Dniester and Lugansk. So, the idea that they would practice some kind of aggression against a neighboring state, they'd done that before. And the Western response was just barely anything. They had some individual sanctions and they complained, but there was not really the kind of substantive response that would have been necessary to establish deterrence. So, from the Russian perspective, they got slapped with relatively minor sanctions and some diplomatic penalties, but beyond that, not much. And really, trade more or less resumed to pre-crisis levels, after each of these incidents in a matter of months. So if you're Moscow, and you're sitting there and you're thinking about invading Ukraine, you probably just assume you can get away with it without too much fuss from the West. You'll get yelled at for a couple months and then things will probably return to normal. It's kind of like that scene from Inglorious Bastards, right? I'll get chewed out. That's fine. I've been chewed out before.
Yeah.
So from the Russian perspective, like, why not invade Ukraine? What's deterring them? Like, what do they have to lose? Like, if the West doesn't really care, and the West gave every indication that it didn't really care, then why not? I'm not saying they invaded Ukraine because they really needed it or really wanted it. Really, I think it was just more about political theater for Putin. Putin's government has kind of been losing some legitimacy and popularity in Russian politics over the past 10 years, off and on. And pretty much one of the main ways that they managed to bump legitimacy was by appeasing nationalists for these little foreign adventures. Donbass 2014 was one such example. Popularity ratings went through the roof for the government after the intervention there. So they were probably hoping for something similar here. Obviously, that blew up in their face, not only because of the West ended up caring quite a bit, but also because the Russian army just failed, like in so many ways. The planning was just bad, the logistics were bad. It was just not ready for the conflict they got into. And full credit to Ukraine as well. Probably I can't prove it, but one of the assumptions I've read that, analysts think is likely for the Russians to have made before the war is that the Ukrainian army would be no better in 2022 than it was in 2014. They fully expected people to just walk away in the event of a Russian invasion or to be very ineffectual in fighting. They were expecting the Ukrainian army to just have all of the same problems it did, 8 some years ago. And they were wrong on that as well. That was the other big miscalculation. The Ukrainian army had undergone a number of reforms. It still had some problems. And there were still some people who were, pro-Russian or who just didn't give a shit and didn't do their job in the opening phase of the war. I think that was more of a problem in the south. But overall, much tougher than expected, and the Russian army was much worse than expected. So the miscalculations regarded Western response and Ukrainian army slash Russian army. And the result is that Russia ended up in a extremely violent conventional war that pretty much nobody, even outside of Russia, was expecting or expected would even be possible. The expectation for among Westerners was that if Russia invaded, they would roll over the Ukrainian army, and then there would be a violent occupation. And then it would be the decision of the West as to the degree to which they wanted to help that resistance. But that would also give the West the luxury of, cynicism. Like it would be easy for people in the event of an occupation of Ukraine to argue, well, the Russians already took it. Natural gas and the well-being of our economies is more important than Ukraine, so Why don't we just have this be the new status quo? And in that sense, Russia could just offer occupied Ukraine as a kind of fait accompli that the West might not have the will to really try to challenge. We probably would have still given some aid to resistance fighters, but I don't know how realistically substantive it would have been. I mean, the US in particular is pretty down on foreign interventions these days, especially after Iraq and Afghanistan. And I would go so far as to say that if Europe had not responded as strongly as it did to the invasion of Ukraine, the US probably would have sat it out in large part. It was largely European interests that kind of gave the US government a easy access point there to actually do something.
Yeah, Chat's mentioning here that Crimea was also something that didn't really have as intensive a response from the West. So
Hmm.
maybe they use that as kind of like an example case of, oh, well, we took this territory and they didn't really do too much about it. So maybe we could do a larger scale thing and they would react similarly, which is not really reacting.
Well, it's not even just conflict. I mean, even if you look at something like the assassinations, right? Like the Skripal poisoning, just any of the cases involving nerve agent, Novichok, being used outside of Russia to assassinate somebody. A lot of that happened in Europe, but Europe didn't really do much in response. Like, I think they ejected some Russian diplomats or something, but otherwise, pretty muted. I mean, it really should have been more. Like, having a foreign government assassinate people in your own country, that should be a big deal. But a lot of European states and the United States as well really did not respond as strongly as they should have to that. So that's just another example of how little the West was necessarily concerned with Russia. Russia just had every reason to believe that there would be a muted response here in 2022 than with all of these other examples. Just there was always responses that gave ample room for people to interpret them as being feckless. And it's not just Russians that have seen the Western response as feckless to these various provocations. There have been lots of commentators who have argued as much as well, but they were not in power, and lots of people were willing to overlook various Russian intransigencies in preference for trying to maintain the status quo. They didn't really want to rock the boat too much. It just made more sense to kind of focus on stuff they felt was more important, like energy transition, economic reform, or, the Middle East or China or what have you. So, to a degree, that's understandable. But at the same time, we see now what happens when you just let issues like this kind of metastasize, and it's not good. So, long story short, there was a severe lack of deterrence by the West that was one of the leading causes here of the conflict in Ukraine. And this is actually one of the reasons I'm so critical of people who say that, the West provoked Russia into doing this. Saying we provoked them implies that we did something, which, again, we really didn't. Like, there was really a lack of proactivity here on the part of the West vis-a-vis Ukraine. Like, if we wanted to really deter a Russian invasion and really help Ukraine, there was a lot we could have done that would have been very provocative to Russia that we did not do. In retrospect, we should have done it, or we should have done nothing. We should have just said, Ukraine is in Russia's sphere of influence. We're not going to mess with that. We're going to focus on our own stuff. Like, one or the other would have been preferable to what we did instead, which was to kind of give some support, but not really enough to actually make a difference, and to not really deter Russia from engaging in what we would consider bad behavior of one kind or another, not only in Ukraine, but in Europe more generally. Really our policy, that is to say, the US policy as well as the European policy on Ukraine, was not designed to help Ukraine or help Russia or anything else other than helping politicians in the West. By being wishy-washy and not really committing one way or the other, they were able to hedge their bets and prevent themselves from being criticized for committing too much to Ukraine and potentially provoking Russia, or from being too appeasing to Russia and its demands. They could kind of hold both positions at the same time and pretend to be trying to hedge in some way over the long term and trying to negotiate some kind of settlement. The Minsk Accords are a good case in point of that. So it was really a foreign policy designed to protect political careers more than it was to actually achieve any kind of particular objective. And that's really my biggest criticism of the approach that was taken. And it's why, again, I don't think the Russian nationalists are correct in saying that the West was being provocative. There were definitely some things that could be interpreted, especially if you're a nationalist, as provocative, but I don't think those things were actually substantive.
Hmm. Yeah, if anything, it was the non-reaction with Crimea that would be encouraging of like, oh, there's not really anything stopping us from doing more of this sort of a deal.
Yeah.
And
I
then
mean,
one difference too with Russian adventurism in their sphere in their region is Ukraine is a lot more interconnected with some other countries they've messed with a little bit. So it was closer to home for a lot of people who like they have a software company and they have a bunch of people who live in Ukraine who work for that company. All of a sudden their employees are like needing to evacuate and leave. So for us and even in the esports scene, we know lots of Ukrainian pro gamers. It's more interconnected with the rest of Europe than a lot of other places are.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it makes a bigger difference just on those terms.
Hmm. Then the other
Yeah, I had a,
question was Bulgaria. Is there any
oh,
reason
right,
they might get
Bulgaria.
roped into it?
I mean, it's already roped into it, really. I think the Bulgarian government already gave some equipment to Ukraine, some of the old sort of stuff they'd gotten from the Soviets back in the day.
Hmm.
Earlier in the conflict, it's been a couple months, but earlier in the conflict, the emphasis in terms of foreign aid of equipment was very much on former Soviet equipment,
Hmm.
because that was the equipment the Ukrainian army was used to.
Hmm.
And most of that stuff was held by Eastern European states, for obvious reasons. Those states were almost all in the Eastern Bloc, during the Cold War. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, and if I am, let me know, but I think Bulgaria was among the states that did provide some of that equipment. Probably wasn't all that much. I don't think Bulgaria's army is all that large, but I do think they contributed something. Uh, but beyond that, it's already sort of in the Western Bloc generally. And nominally, Bulgaria had been kind of on board with, sanctions and whatnot. In fact, I believe Bulgaria was one of the states that was cut off from Russian natural gas very early because they refused to pay in rubles, uh, nor were they willing to engage in sort of the compromise agreement by which they would pay technically in a foreign currency, but would be immediately transferred from account to account in Switzerland into rubles. It was some convoluted bullshit scheme in which everybody could kind of pretend like they got what they wanted.
Hmm.
But the Bulgarian government wasn't even willing to do that, so they got cut off. There was a couple states that got cut off pretty early on that count. I think Poland was one of the other ones. But I think more recently Bulgaria had a change in government, and the new government is a little more Eurosceptical, I guess. Well, maybe not Eurosceptical. That's a much broader term, but they've been more willing to try to negotiate with the Russian state, specifically with regard to natural gas. And so they've been a little more cagey about their commitment to Ukraine.
Hmm.
So, assuming that government gets their way, they may be much less involved in the conflict as it is. But, given that they are participating, at least nominally, in European Union sanctions, and that they're a NATO member state, and that they probably, if I'm remembering correctly, already gave some aid to Ukraine, they're already involved.
Hmm.
If the West, well, for example, if Russia escalates in Ukraine and maybe uses a nuclear weapon, the Western response would probably involve Bulgaria to some degree. Certainly, the Russian government would probably not be willing to recognize the nuance of Bulgaria being a member of a hostile military alliance, but also being a little skeptical about Ukraine. If Bulgarian territory were used to launch strikes against Russian troops in Ukraine, Bulgaria would be targeted. Maybe not targeted militarily necessarily, although hypothetically that would be possible too. But certainly Russian retaliation would probably encompass Bulgaria as well as other states that were participating. Yeah, I don't. Hypothetically, Russia could try to isolate Bulgaria by trying to give them something they wanted and in an effort to try to peel them off from the Western alliance, but I don't think that the Bulgarian government would have enough support to really make that work. Russia would want a lot in order to try to kind of exclude Bulgaria from general retaliation
Hmm.
against any Western escalation of any kind in Ukraine. And I don't think they have the political capital to do that right now. That is to say, the Bulgarian government, I don't think, has the political capital to make changes that extensive.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't really think it's possible to kind of toe the line on this, right? Like, if you're either going to be part of the anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian bloc of European countries, or you're going to be more pro-Russian. I think it's going to be really hard to be both.
Hmm.
Hungary can kind of do that, but Hungary is going to pay for that later. Europe was already pretty upset with them, and it isn't going to get any better after this. And Bulgaria in particular is not in a good position. Hungary is kind of on the border there with Ukraine. I don't think Bulgaria is. Yeah, Bulgaria is well to the south of Ukraine. So they don't really have the same kind of leverage in that regard. And also Bulgaria, I mean, it's much, much weaker, right? It's a much poorer country than even Hungary, if I'm not mistaken. I think the GDP per cap is still among the poorest in Europe. Not the poorest. It's definitely, better than like, Kosovo or something. I think it's even better than Romania, but it's got a long way to go to kind of reach Central Asian or Central European levels,
Hmm.
I believe anyway. Maybe they've come a long way. I haven't paid too much attention to the Balkans in the past year or two. But that means that they have less leverage to throw around either within Europe or outside of Europe. And I think overall, Bulgaria will probably be better off within the European Union. But that inherently means there's going to have to be a less independent foreign policy. So I don't think they can really stop the European Union from being anti-Russia right now without incurring penalties. But unless they try to do that, I don't think Russia will kind of give them any favors, so to speak.
Hmm.
So invariably, Bulgaria is going to be involved. I don't think there's any avoiding that. Unless you want to go like full Viktor Orban, but I don't think anybody really, I don't think people in Bulgaria want to do that. I've never heard of like a big populist movement in Bulgaria in that vein. But maybe I'm just not familiar enough with the country's politics.
It's a country that I don't know too much about.
Oh no,
No, not really.
it's pretty neat. They were originally from what is now called Tatarstan, which is actually an autonomous republic in central Russia. It's like sort of east of Moscow, west of the Ural Mountains, sort of that area. And they'd originally been Turkish Muslims, I believe,
Hmm.
and they migrated from there to southeastern Europe. And what was it? They lost their religion and they lost their language, I believe. So they became Christians and they became Slavic, speaking basically a Slavic language. But they actually kept the name Bulgar. Yeah, the Tatars were originally called Bulgars. Later on, they became Tatars. But the Bulgars that migrated to Bulgaria kind of maintained the name. So it's kind of a unique history there in that regard. And then, what was it? Later on, they were conquered by the Turks, and they became a vassal state for a long time. And then eventually they got independence, I want to say early 20th century. Actually, no, it would have been late 19th century, is when Russia was messing with Turkey, kept trying to kind of peel them off, make them not vassal states per se, but kind of implicit allies of Russia in the region. The Tsarist Russian government always kind of claimed southeastern Europe for itself based off of a common Slavicness and also a common religion. Orthodoxy was the main religion in much of southeastern Europe, and still is. And after Bulgaria became independent from the Ottoman Empire, they fought a lot. There was a lot of wars at the time. But I remember Bulgaria in particular was noted for being relatively good at it. I seem to remember them being known as the Prussia of the Balkans for a while. So the government there kind of had its shit together as far as being able to organize its military. And I think the government also had a relatively decent administrative state. Still corruption and whatnot, but it was relatively put together for the region. It's to the point where Bulgaria's economy was actually doing pretty good in the period before World War One. And then, of course, the wars happened, and then everything kind of went to shit for a while. And then during the interwar years, it was doing pretty good. But then World War II happened. And then the Cold War happened, and of course, communist domination. But even then, it was actually one of the better performers in the Eastern Bloc, or at least the Balkans, as far as state capacity. And so it was actually developing pretty nicely until communism collapsed, and then that presented a new shock, and it took them a while to recover from that. And I think they've kind of been getting back to normal since then. I think they've done relatively well. Again, still a long way to go. GDP is still relatively low, but among states in the Balkans, I think Bulgaria has done relatively well for itself. Not quite Slovenia levels of good, but kind of up there.
Cool. I didn't know that they had a language and religion switch like that, but that makes sense.
And it's basically assimilating into the local population.
Mm-hmm.
It's a heavily Slavic area. There's lots of weird little groups like that in the Balkans. The Hungarians are a good example. They're not Indo-European, right? Most every ethnic group in Europe speaks some kind of Indo-European. Well, I guess it's still Indo-European, but it's either Germanic or Romance, one or the other type of language. But Magyar, I'm probably mispronouncing it, but the Hungarian language is called Magyar. And that's more of a Finno-Ugric language. It's not really part of the same language tree as other European languages. It's got its own thing going on. And that territory was originally settled by barbarians coming from, I think, Central Asia. They kind of swung in, conquered that territory that is now Hungary, and kind of made it their own. Yeah, Hungary was actually a really powerful kingdom in the medieval era. It was sort of the last major bulwark between Central Europe and the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of held out for a long time before corruption and institutional decay got them. It's pretty easy after that for the Ottomans to conquer them.
Mm-hmm.
Institutions are important.
True. If you want to get stuff done. Yeah, it's interesting how you have that. It's almost like a life cycle of an empire or a country or whatever, where it can start out on the weaker side, and then they have some kind of economic and population boom or a technology advantage for some reason, and that causes them to have like a surplus of people and energy, and they can go for expanding their domain, take out some neighboring stuff, maybe Viking some people, do whatever they want to, and then whenever they get really established, they reach some kind of apex point for that period of the life cycle where they're really strong and they've got a lot of influence and power. And then as that system is set up, there are people who want to try to exploit that selfishly for themselves. And that's when it gets a bunch of holes in it and it's not able to maintain itself anymore. And then its neighbors can basically push it over at a point.
Yep. Ebb and flow. Cycles of history.
Yeah, the Bulgarian viewer in chat is saying, before the communists fucked us up, we were pretty strong before 1944.
Interesting perspective. In general, I had thought that Hungary kind of struggled a bit after World War One, just because of all of the instability in the region.
Mm-hmm.
There was certainly, like in the 1920s, there was a lot of violence. I remember Hungary, I think, had like a very brief communist government, did it not? It didn't last long. People were pretty quick to get rid of it. But I think it was Hungary that very briefly had one.
Hmm.
But that was kind of endemic. That was kind of indicative of the level of instability they had. There was various radicals kind of running around. And I think Hungary had a dictatorship in the 1930s. I think it was far right, if I'm not mistaken. I know they were on relatively good terms with Germany. And wasn't he an admiral? I think I'm remembering there was like an admiral who managed to get in charge of Hungary for a while, which is super weird because it's a landlocked country. You wouldn't think they would have one, but I think he somehow ended up being dictator.
Hmm.
Maybe I'm mixing the countries up here. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. Yeah, I do remember Hungary being pretty strong in the medieval era, but I hadn't really heard of it being relatively well off in the early 20th century.
Huh. They're also saying that the Cyrillic script was first created in the First Bulgarian Empire. The
Ah,
oldest inscription of it is in a cave in Bulgaria.
well, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm sending you the link to that in Discord.
Yeah, the medieval Hungarian kingdom was amongst the wealthiest in Europe. They had a lot of gold, I think was one of the main things they had. So they had a lot of resources to work with, and that kind of gave the government room to invest in not only a large army and fortifications, but also education and other institutions. Hungary was relatively tolerant for that era. They actually had a decent number of Protestants for a while.
Hmm.
Yeah, other kingdoms kind of cracked down on that. They didn't like that. But the Hungarian state didn't care so much at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was
Spain
pretty cool.
definitely cared.
Yeah, Spain cared about a lot of stuff
Uh,
back in the day. Way too much, unfortunately, for the Dincians of the Spanish Empire.
yeah, that's an interesting one of a very expansive empire that had a pretty decent amount of power and a lot of land that they just claimed for themselves. And nowadays, it's one of the less wealthy countries in Europe.
It's mid-tier. It's probably what you would. I think it's developed now. For a long time, though, yeah, it was definitely behind.
Mm-hmm.
I think they've been doing better the past couple decades. Is it per capita? 27K? That's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
27K per cap is pretty decent. That's like upper range, middle income, lower range developed country. But yeah, they had a lot of problems after the empire. The government didn't really know how to handle all the gold. There was a bunch of gold being mined in the Americas that was brought over. And, some of it was used just to pay people, but the Spanish government ended up with a lot of it. And they just spent so much of it. Like, they spent so much gold that they got from the Americas that it caused inflation in the economy. And the result is that Spanish producers were just not competitive. It was just easier to buy from outside Spain than it was to buy at the inflated prices in Spain. So a lot of the productive forces of Spain's economy ended up going under.
What did they use the gold for? Like, what did they buy with it?
Well, it depends on who you're talking about. Like for the Spanish government,
Mm-hmm.
they would buy it on stuff like the army or the navy. Have you ever heard of the Battle of Lepanto?
No.
That was a naval battle in the 1500s, and it was one of the first major naval battles that Europeans were able to win against the Ottoman Empire. And most of the fleet that fought for the Europeans was Spanish. It was a Spanish fleet, and I think there was also Venetian ships there as well, some smattering of some others. But yeah, they were able to successfully challenge, the Ottoman Navy. But that was not cheap. In order to build the Spanish Armada, it cost them a lot. And maintaining, armies in what would you call them? The Low Countries, Belgium, what is now the Netherlands and Belgium. That also was pretty expensive, especially after, the wars of independence started. And they called that the 80 Years' War. Protestants in the Low Provinces and the Low Country were particularly restive, especially since the Spanish, kind of responded to what they perceived as apostates, apostate Protestants, as well, they responded violently to them. There was lots of violence. Cities were razed, people tortured. It was not great.
Mm-hmm.
But maintaining armies large enough to do that also cost a lot of money. Maybe you've heard about the attempted Spanish invasion of England in the late 1500s?
No?
Yeah, yeah, they did that. Well, they tried to do that.
Huh.
The English were some of the biggest pirates in the Americas. English pirates were very, very active. You've probably heard about like privateers and whatnot.
Yeah.
So a lot of those were English. And finally, the Spanish government kind of had enough of it, and they assembled not only their armada, the Spanish armada, but also a large contingent of ground troops that were to be landed in England so that would go on to conquer the country. So the only reason that failed is because the Royal Navy, such as it was at the time, was able to catch the Spanish armada in port. And what they used were what were called fire ships. So these were ships that were set on fire and then floated into the armada. And because the ships in port were so close together, the fire ships would, catch them alight, and then the fire would spread from ship to ship. And not the entire armada was not destroyed in this way. What happened is that the fire spread quickly, destroyed a lot of ships, and then the rest of the ships scrambled to leave port. But they did not leave in any kind of organized way. So the ships just scrambled and ran off in every direction, and the Royal Navy was able to pick them off individually. And so this was how they were able to not only destroy the Spanish Armada, or at least a better part of it, but also prevent the invasion of England. So this was a big deal in the late 1500s. The Queen at the time was Queen Elizabeth. Yeah, Queen Elizabeth, and this was one of the things that really made her famous in the history of England.
Ah.
Yeah, I want to say there was a Shakespearean play about it, or at least about her. Some damn thing, or maybe I'm thinking of a movie.
Yeah, if memory serves, she was pretty hawkish as far as some of the British monarchs go.
Well, she had to be. If you're being a queen in the 1500s was not easy.
You don't get to
Women.
choose dovish. It's not an option.
Well, I mean, you don't want to be seen as weak, right? You're a woman in the 1500s, so people already kind of perceived you as suffering from perceived weaknesses of the sex, right?
Right.
Women were seen as weak, and so you had to exude a certain amount of strength above and beyond the normal in order to try to kind of deflect that. So the result is that she was, pretty out there, pretty bombastic overall. What am I thinking of? Kind of bum the hell out. Well, supposedly she was around at the same time as Shakespeare, so saw some of his plays, so they were contemporaries at least. I don't know why I'm thinking of it. But yeah, anyway, stuff that Spain spent money on. So fleets, armies, um, probably a lot of luxury goods. Royal families and nobles were pretty big spenders back in Europe at the time. So just stuff like that, effectively. And the result was a lot of inflation in Spain's economy. And that had a lot of negative effects on the health of the Spanish economy to the point where they actually ended up defaulting on their debt several times over the course of the 1500s and 1600s. So, as powerful as the Spanish Empire was at the time, mismanagement of the economy hobbled it in a lot of ways, and its power was not enduring as a result. Yeah, the Spanish Empire in the Americas was not as big as you might think. Like, if you look at it on a map, it looks like they just controlled everything, but
But they didn't
the
really have
reality,
people there.
yeah, they didn't really have people there. Like, the administrative capacity that was available at the time was inherently limited, and it was even more limited in the Americas because there weren't that many people in general of any kind, but there were even fewer people, well, even fewer Spanish people, like Spaniards. And among them, there was only a very small number of actual, political figures, governors, Spanish officials, whatnot. And so their ability to actually police and govern all of that territory that they had taken was very limited as a result, with the effect that the actual size of the effective Spanish Empire was much, much smaller than it looks like on the map. Mostly they focused their administrative efforts on like the big cities, like Mexico City and Lima in particular, and then also on areas where there were valuable resources. And then on the area between, natural resources and ports. So, ports of entry, those had governance, the capitals had governance, places with like really large, valuable mines like Potosi in South America, those had governance. And then they would try to patrol the trade routes so that the resources, specifically the gold and silver that was mined in the Americas, could be safely moved from the mines to the docks so that they could be loaded on ships and exported. But other than that, all the rural territories beyond that, and especially frontiers, where there was not as much to kind of attract attention, like raw resources or whatnot, those areas were kind of left more on their own.
Hmm.
One of the big historical events, you might say, in the history of the Spanish Empire was the Bourbon reforms. So these were reforms undertaken by the new royal family of Spain after they took power as a result of the War of Spanish Succession at the beginning of the 1700s. And they implemented a number of reforms in an effort to try to extract more wealth from the Americas by improving the quality of governing institutions there. And when I say quality, I don't mean like nicer or more representative. I just mean like in general, more professional governors and administrators that were actually good at doing their job and more efficient at governing, such that they could get more tax revenue out of the colonies. So the fact that that was a major focus for them kind of illustrates how important that was and how lacking it was before the reforms. I think even before that, in the 1600s, there was a similar example. In the early 1600s, Spain was pretty heavily involved with the 30 Years' War, as well as just religious conflict in general in Europe, which was pretty expensive. And what I read is that that led them, or at least was one of the contributing factors for the Spanish Empire focusing governance in the colonies on extraction rather than expansion. So instead of trying to actually spread authority beyond the capitals and other centers of governance, they mostly focused on reinforcing governance where it already existed. So building up and fortifying ports, cities, what have you, was more the impetus so that they could try to get more value and money out of the territories.
Yeah, there's also trying to manage whatever the native population is there, and like how either they're trying to conquer and take over some existing empire that's in the Americas, or they're trying to assimilate and convert, which is another angle. And then I've heard that in North America, at least, the concept of land ownership was not quite the same as it is in Europe. Where in Europe, it's like you own this plot of land, it is yours, like an item or a possession, versus the more broader concept of the earth is the place that we exist and you can set up your home, but you don't have quite the same hard set borders. There would definitely be territorial disputes and stuff between different tribes, so it's not like, oh, the land is just for everybody for all different tribes of Native Americans, but definitely some different cultural understandings of what property means and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there would have been some institutional clash there as
Yeah.
far as perspectives, and it would have taken time to kind of get it sorted.
Mm-hmm.
But if you lived in one of the areas outside one of the audiencias or one of the other governing centers, it would have been a moot point. There basically would not really have been anybody to tell you to do things any differently.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to remember what I want to say the audiencias were like the judicial capitals. They would have these towns or cities where there would be judicial figures, judicial officials rather, like judges and whatnot, who were responsible for adjudicating disputes and otherwise enforcing the written law. I believe those were called audiencias, but then they also had other centers as well that were more administrative centers rather than judicial centers,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't remember what they were called. Yeah,
Yeah.
Mexico City was a major administrative center. That was more in New Spain in the north. And then Bogota, if I'm not mistaken, was the center of what was called New Granada, sort of in the northern part of South America. And then they had Lima for pretty much the rest in South America.
Lima, Peru.
Yeah. Buenos Aires kind of came later. I think eventually it kind of got to be its own thing, but it took a long time. It didn't have the same mineral resources that attracted so many people, in the first couple hundred years of the Spanish Empire. So what would become Argentina was kind of a late bloomer in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly a frontier before that. There was also a lot of development in the islands. Cuba was basically the first place that was like fully colonized. So that was relatively well built up in comparison to the other territories.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't nearly as wealthy either. So I think the Spanish kind of moved on relatively quickly after settling it.
Did Portugal establish a presence in other places besides Brazil? Because that's
Oh,
only.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, they set up in Angola
Uh,
and Mozambique in Africa. That was mostly the coastal regions of those two countries. They didn't really penetrate deeper into later in the 19th century. And then they also had what's now called Cape Verde,
mm-hmm.
which is basically a little sort of island archipelago off the west coast of Africa. And then they also had what's called, oh hell, what is it? Uh, Guinea-Bissau. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but it's a very small coastal country in West Africa. And the Portuguese had like a little sliver there. Whenever you see European colonies in Africa, just know that basically the Europeans only really colonized the coast, and the interior was not really even claimed until the late 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So those interior territories were not really well developed, even by the time those countries became independent in the mid 20th century. So Portugal had some coastal colonies more in the south. It's worth pointing out, too, though, that while Portugal didn't have very many colonies in Africa, the colonies they did have were amongst the first that the Europeans had on the continent.
Mm-hmm.
So, like the Portuguese colony in Angola, sort of the northwestern coast of what is now Angola, I think were like the first major colony in the southern hemispheric part of Africa. Although it wasn't much of a colony for a long time. It was actually really dangerous for Europeans to go there. They didn't have the same understanding of medicine that Europeans would have much later. And so the result is that disease was a major problem for Europeans in Africa. And that was actually one of the major blocks that stopped them from really expanding to any significant degree until much later on in history.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also had they had some stuff in the Middle East for a while, but they ended up losing it later on. I think like 1800s or so. I think have you ever heard of Socotra?
No, what is that?
It's sort of this funky island that's south of Yemen, and it's known for having some of the most unique plant life on the planet.
Oh, I think I've heard of that. They have like really weird looking trees and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, they took a different evolutionary path, and
Mm-hmm.
they probably have more in common with trees that existed like millions of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So that island was actually a staging point for the Portuguese. They kind of controlled it for a little while. I think the British ended up with it later on, though. Let's see, they also settled some islands in the what is now Indonesia, basically the East Indies,
Mm-hmm.
which is why there's Catholicism there. I think there's also some Protestants, but Christianity effectively was introduced to the East Indies by the Portuguese. And that's also where they got East Timor. They weren't able to keep a lot of the islands in the East Indies. The Dutch ended up taking most of those, but the Portuguese were able to hang on to East Timor. So that's why that's a predominantly Catholic country with a slightly unique history amongst the islands in the region. And then you've probably heard of Macau, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that was also a Portuguese colony that they settled relatively early. I want to say like 1500s,
Hmm.
late 1500s or so. So yeah, they did get around. I think uh I think another interesting question there is how Portugal was able to maintain control of all these territories even after they sort of declined as a significant power over the course of the 1600s and 1700s. Why did not the Dutch or the British take all of these? And the answer is that Portugal actually has a weird relationship with the UK. The British and the Portuguese actually signed an alliance way back in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period of European history. And that alliance is actually still technically in effect and remains so, all through that sort of early period of discovery, like 1500s, 1600s, and then 1700s and 1800s as well. So over that period when the British were in the ascendant, as well as the Dutch for that matter, they never really preyed on the Portuguese Empire, at least not significantly, because they were more or less aligned in terms of their, friendship. It's kind of like the relationship between Hungary and Poland. They've got this sort of weird historical friendship that goes back, several centuries. Portugal and England have something similar.
Hmm.
And so, because they had relatively good relations with the leading empire of the era, 1700s, 1800s, and into the 20th century, the Portuguese were able to maintain control over a lot of their territories, even though they were relatively weak and probably would not have been able to defend them against the British if they had tried to take them from them.
It seems like naval technology was something that quite a few different countries figured out to do all this imperialism stuff, being able to navigate going long distances and then figuring out what's far to the west and then also what's in Africa and the Middle East and so on.
Yeah, you can thank Henry the Navigator for that. The development of oceanic travel and the technological developments required for that was not entirely pioneered by the Portuguese and Henry the Navigator, but he played a big role in institutionalizing it. Henry actually built a school for navigators in Portugal,
Hmm.
and they produced a lot of the early navigators and shipbuilders, for that matter, who were able to travel abroad and basically initiate the European age of discovery.
Hmm. That's cool. I haven't heard of this guy. Prince Henry the Navigator. I just linked his wiki in the chat. 1394 to 1460.
Oh, yeah. He was something of a visionary. He wanted to explore, um, partly for money. That's always a motivator, but also because he believed that there was a Christian kingdom that was out there, basically somewhere, that had been separated from the rest of Christendom
Hmm.
and that was waiting to be discovered and that would ally with them against the Muslim empires of the era, which were pretty aggressive at that time. It took a long time for it to produce results. I think it took like 100 years for the Portuguese to even get down to equatorial Africa on the west coast.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very slow process, but eventually they were able to jump around the Cape and make their way to India. They were basically, effectively, the first Europeans to make that trip by sail,
Mm-hmm.
certainly around Africa. And that initiated European contact and trade with the Far East, which previously had only occurred through intermediaries, specifically through the Middle East. And it was actually the initiation of that trade that led to the economic decline of the Middle East. The Middle Eastern empires were largely trade empires, and they made a lot of their money off of trade between Western buyers and Eastern sellers, as
Mm-hmm.
well as vice versa. But when they were cut out of that trade, they lost a lot of money over time and eventually declined. But yeah, naval technology was basically the impetus for that process. That's how it got started.
Yep, you need to have the
Techno
boats that can handle the long journeys, then you also need the wherewithal to know which way you're going so you don't get lost.
oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm remembering Goa now is another place that was a Portuguese territory for a while, Goa, India.
Yeah, you're right. I forgot about them.
Yeah, Goa is really well known for anyone who's into the psytrance scene because Goa is a subgenre of psytrance. It has like a little bit more of a fast tempo to it. Apparently, Goa has a really cool psytrance party scene over there. But yeah, that's
Huh.
a bit of a carryover from maybe some Portuguese influence. It's a bit of a different slice of India.
Yeah, there's a lot of Christians there for one. And maybe not as many as you might think. I don't think they're a majority, but they do have a lot of Christians there. And I think part of the issue is that it's a touristy place now. Tourism is the main industry. It had been even before Goa was sort of reintegrated into India, but it's only kind of gotten bigger since then. Yeah, the Portuguese were basically given Goa by, I think, the Mughal Empire in the sort of mid late 1500s. And that was basically an exchange. You know, the Portuguese got Goa in exchange. They had to agree to stop being assholes in the ocean. They were, well, their whole business model basically was piracy, right?
Uh,
Like, they did initiate trade. They did buy stuff in India and sell it back in Europe. But they also tried to interrupt trade by other local merchants, and they tried to exact what was effectively a tax. Basically, it was extortion. So if you didn't have like a special permit to trade that you had to pay for, in order to get, then they would just steal your shit, and raid your ships like pirates would. And because nobody could stop them, it made more sense for the Mughal Empire to just pay them off. Like they were basically super pirates. There had always been pirates in the region, but before, if the Ottoman Empire, in conjunction with the Mughal Empire, mobilized their navies, they could generally stop them. But with the Portuguese, they did that and they actually lost. So it was pretty clear that this was a problem that could not be dealt with a military solution. So they ended up just trying to buy them off. And Goa was one of the ways that they tried to do that. It was actually a pretty choice bit of territory. From what I was reading, Goa was originally the center of the horse trade in India. For those of you who don't know, India does not actually have any native breeds of horse. All of the horses that India has had throughout history, they had to import. And so that meant that, given that horses are important for a lot of things like cavalry, trade, beasts of burden, whatnot, that meant that there was a lot of demand for horses in India. And because India was so wealthy historically, they could pay for that. That was a thriving trade for many centuries. And a lot of the horses that were imported from either Central Asia or the Middle East. And Goa was a center for the horses that were being imported from the Middle East. And because it was such a lucrative trade, it was a pretty valuable port. And the Portuguese effectively were able to gain control of that trade as a result. So it wasn't just the land that the Moguls were using to try to buy off the Portuguese. It was also the revenue from the horse trade, which was, again, quite lucrative. Pretty good deal if you were Portuguese at the time.
Shout out to the joke in chat that the Portuguese got the go ahead.
Yeah, they did. And they held on to it for a long time. They actually got even more than that. They got some other territories that were much smaller. I think Damon and Dew is what they were called. And technically, those are still what are called Union territories, separate territories in India directly controlled by the government. They were also given I'm not sure what it was called at the time, but basically the little peninsula that Bombay is on. That was originally given to the Portuguese. And the only reason it ended up under the control of the English was because of a marriage. I think that was I think that was also in the 1500s, late 1500s. There was a marriage between an English king and a Portuguese princess. I think this would have been before Queen Elizabeth. But basically, because of that marriage, there was a dowry given. basically as a kind of gift to the newlyweds. And part of the Portuguese dowry was the territory of Bombay. And that was how the English actually got control of it. And of course, Bombay would go on to be one of the centers of the British Empire in India later on. Still pretty important. It's it's one of the largest cities on the planet right now, so
Hmm.
but probably would not be so if not for that wedding. So interesting little historical connections there.
Nice.
We doing okay on time?
Yep, got about 45 minutes,
Gotcha. Yeah, Goa is 25% Christian. So
which
they're a
is
minority.
relatively high for India, though.
Yeah, exactly. That's relatively high. I think you'd have to go into the far eastern states of India in order to find higher. Now that maybe Kerala could give them a run. Kerala, I think Kerala is like 20%. Let's take a look. Demographics, 18%. So a little bit lower. What else did we have going? Well, was there anything else you kind of wanted to touch on here?
Did I? Let me double check, see if I got all the questions. I think I got most of them. So, Moss was asking, the vast majority of UN countries have come out against the Russian aggression. 5 countries have declined to condemn it.
Oh
Some
yeah.
abstained. One of
Yeah,
them
he
is
was asking me.
Nicaragua.
Yeah, he was asking me about that on Twitter.
Yeah, why is Nicaragua on Putin's side?
So Nicaragua's president right now is a guy named Ortega. I think Daniel Ortega. And he's he's an interesting figure. Right now, he's more of a left-wing populist politician. So he's sort of economically left-wing, wants big government subsidies, support to people, whatnot. But on social issues, he's pretty conservative now.
Mm-hmm.
But he used to be pretty hard left on everything. He was a member and the leader of the Sandinistas, which was a left-wing revolutionary group in Nicaragua that successfully overthrew the Somozas. And the Somozas were a family that effectively controlled everything in Nicaragua. It pretty much owned everything that was worth owning, dominated the political system. It was basically just their little personal fiefdom. And they were able to get control of Nicaragua like that because the family patriarch, I don't remember his first name, but basically he had been head of the Guardia Nacional, which is, I'm mispronouncing that certainly, National Guard, which was a military institution in Nicaragua, which had originally been created by the United States. So to kind of go back to the origins here, I have to go back to the early 20th century. Just general background, Nicaragua is a country in Central America, and generally it's been the poorest, or at least among the poorest countries in Central America. And Central America is already not particularly wealthy, so I think that's kind of saying something. Nicaragua had been subject to the series of wars in the region that kind of spanned the late 19th century, early 20th century, which involved a lot of, to a degree, ideological conflict between, sort of the conservatives who were more Catholic and the Republicans who were a little more secular. But there was also a lot of clashes of personality. There were a lot of what were called caudillos, which were basically strongmen who competed for power. And then there was also a lot of local revolutionary groups, nationalists of one sort or another as well, that would kind of compete with each other and with the powers that be. And also foreign corporations were involved as well. That was like the fruit companies, specifically like United Fruit Company in the US, but also others. So they would set up big plantations that would produce fruit for export, and they would pay off, rebel groups of one sort or another to not attack them, basically as a kind of extortion or payment in response to extortion, rather. But they would also have pretty close ties with the government. And so they would also try to influence the government policymaking process to ensure that their interests were respected to one degree or another. So it was a relatively unstable, violent place in a lot of Central American countries in that particular period. And at one point, the U.S. government got involved. They would nominally cite U.S. interests in trying to protect property of U.S. nationals in Nicaragua, among other countries that they intervened in at the time. But also, the kind of underlying driver there was concern about Europeans. There was always a concern that European empires might cite debt default as an excuse to try to intervene and set up a puppet government. So that was sort of the underlying concern behind a number of interventions in the region during this period. So Nicaragua was not unusual in that regard. Regardless, the U.S. sent in the Marine Corps to try to help restore stability and allow the government to kind of restore its authority. And it did not work. The U.S. Marines were in Nicaragua for a very long time. I think it was something like 20 years, trying to help the government put down revolutions of one sort or another. And very unsuccessful. Anybody who's fought in Iraq will probably find the history of U.S. involvement in Nicaragua during those 20 years painfully familiar. An unstable government ally and very driven revolutionaries fighting against them, and a lot of failed efforts to try to build up the state of the ally. And ultimately, it was not very successful. I think the only way it was even really brought to an end was one, U.S. withdrawal, and then two, making deals with various powerful rebel groups to try to kind of bring them into the political process.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, let's see. That's Nicaragua, early 20th century. So what they did succeed in doing is developing this institution called the National Guard. And this was an institution developed while the U.S. military was still in Nicaragua. And the idea was to try to build up an indigenous force that could fight for the government, but which was more reliable than the army. It was kind of well, the army is nominally sort of supposed to protect the country from foreign threats. The National Guard was created to be a military force designed to fight internal threats. So that was the genesis of this institution. And the officers were trained by Americans. I think some of them were even trained in the United States. But regardless, it was a U.S. trained, supported, and equipped force that was designed to try to protect the government and put down the rebels. Again, very mixed success in that regard. But even so, after the U.S. left, the National Guard, because it had been, so well equipped and trained by the U.S., was easily the most powerful institution in Nicaragua. And, power brings temptation, and the guy who led the National Guard was this guy named Somoza. And he eventually staged a coup and seized control of the country using the National Guard. And after that, he used his power to basically force everybody to sell stuff to him or to just buy it using government revenue, one or the other. And the result is that his family came to own all of the major assets of Nicaragua. Now, all this happened, that is to say, the coup and whatnot, that happened in, I want to say, the 1930s. Maybe it was 20s, but I think it was 30s. So his family controlled Nicaragua for what, 40 some years, 30s, 40s, about 50 some years. And the US was willing to kind of overlook the family's grip on power. We didn't really care for a long time, for one. We were just happy that he wasn't pro-German in the case of the pre-World War II era and not pro-communist after World War II. He was a relatively reliable ally in that sense. We were a little concerned with the lack of observance of human rights and democracy and whatnot, but the quid pro quo we had with various Central American leaders is that if they at least pretended to care about human rights and had nominal elections, which were at least somewhat free, or at least in which they pretended to be free, then we would overlook their various excesses and just kind of leave them be.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that worked pretty well for everybody except Somoza. And it wasn't because he wasn't willing to do it. It was because they tried to do it and screwed it up. The Somoza family in the late 40s after World War II. Mind you, the period in 1945 and then the immediate aftermath of World War II, that was a period that saw a minor democratic movement across Central America. There were a number of movements that started up protesting and pushing for liberal democratic reforms in various states in Central America. And different states responded in different ways, but in general, they all responded with at least nominally free elections and then some democratic reforms in which the governments would agree to be less restrictive and to be less violent. So the Nicaraguan government under President Somoza tried to do that, but the trouble was that the guy that they had selected to basically be their puppet in the presidency decided not to be their puppet. He was elected and then he said, okay, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. I'm just going to do my own thing. So that was unacceptable to the Somoza family, and they actually just launched a coup and threw him out, and then replaced him with, I think, an uncle, one of Somoza's uncles. So this was all very brazen. Like it was not subtle at all. They were very open about it, and it put the U.S. government in a very awkward position. We didn't really want to get involved, but we also did not really want to give the Soviets any more ammunition than they already had, as far as, U.S. not supporting truly democratic governments and supporting rather authoritarian repressive governments. So the U.S. government responded with mild sanctions and by excluding them from ongoing negotiations regarding the Rio Treaty, which was this security arrangement that was being negotiated at the time to try to link all of the countries in the Western Hemisphere together. So that was embarrassing for all parties involved, and Nicaragua was kind of a pariah for a year or two after that as a result. But eventually, the U.S. government started working with them again, and things kind of returned to normal. So things were pretty stable probably until the 60s or so. And starting in the 60s, and certainly by the 70s, people in Nicaragua had had enough and launched a revolution. Rebel groups formed and tried to overthrow the government. And the leading group was, I don't remember the formal name of the leading rebel group, but they were called Sandinistas for short. And they were pretty largely left-wing socialist in outlook. There were also liberal Democrats as well. But the socialist revolutionaries were probably the main, excuse me, the main group in the revolutionary outfit. So they fought a war for about 10 years, trying to overthrow the Somoza government in Nicaragua. And I think the heaviest fighting was in the 70s. And I remember at one point, the government was having aircraft, working as part of the Nicaraguan Air Force, bombing the poor areas of the capital city of Managua. That being because those were sort of the main redoubts of revolutionary activity. That was where the rebels were sort of hiding. They just sort of had them, the government just kind of had them bombed. It was not exactly a strategy to win hearts and minds, to put it mildly. So it was a pretty violent civil war for a while. But eventually, in I want to say 1979, the government finally collapsed. And after that, the Sandinistas seized power and from there worked to implement a number of reforms. They tried to, uh, for one, take all the property that the Somoza family rather, had kind of hoarded for itself and either put it in the hands of the government or sold it off. And then they also held elections because they did have at least a nominal commitment to liberal democracy. Now, all of this happened in relatively short order, but the trouble that they had was that the Reagan administration in the early 80s was very skeptical. They did not trust the new Sandinista government, not least because they kind of had a relatively pro-Soviet foreign policy. It wasn't anything explicit, but it didn't have to be. For the Reagan administration, it was enough that they were not explicitly pro-US and were not towing the line like Central American states had traditionally done. So the result is that the US started supporting a group that were known as the Contras. And actually, it was a series of different groups, not just one, but collectively they were referred to as the Contras. And nominally, these were disgruntled former rebels. These were guys that had supposedly formally fought with the Sandinistas, or who maybe had even been formerly Sandinistas, but who did not like the way that the new Sandinista government was developing, and so took up arms to try to force it back on a more liberal democratic path, and also probably a less socialistic path. That was another thing that was kind of controversial at the time. And it's debatable whether or not it was really necessary. I doubt Nicaragua was ever really a major national security threat. The U.S. had taken a relatively light approach to revolutionaries in Cuba, and everybody knows how that went. Cuban Missile Crisis, Fidel Castro, communism. It didn't go well. So to a degree, you can kind of understand the U.S. government being paranoid. But the Sandinistas were not really communists. They were more just socialists, and they were willing to entertain democratic elections and whatnot. So probably the U.S. was being a little too reactive here, a little too paranoid. At least that's my understanding of it. But regardless of the veracity of U.S. foreign policy at the time, the result was a pretty nasty civil war that lasted about 10 years. Um, some people say that the U.S. was only supporting mercenaries, that the Contras were not true revolutionaries. There's some truth to that, but there's also truth to the idea that some of the rebels were actually legitimate former members of the Sandinistas who were disenchanted with the rather Ortega government. Ortega, I should say, led the Sandinistas in the 80s. He was president of Nicaragua during most of this period. And eventually, the war ended when there was an agreement between the Contras and the Sandinista government to hold free and fair elections, which they kind of had already had. That's kind of debatable, but for the most part, they'd been free from what I was reading. But in the new elections, it was actually the conservatives that were able to win. And that brought in a center-right government that instituted some policy changes. But regardless, at that point, Ortega was out of power. And after that, he found it difficult to win on a platform of outright, left-wing socialism. Uh, Populist socialism was kind of popular in Latin America, but other left-wing policies, like, especially policies that were antagonistic to the Catholic Church, were much less popular. So what Ortega found over time, especially in the late 90s, early aughts, is that his campaign platform was much more popular when he became more of a populist than a socialist. And so that was the change he made. He didn't really change much in terms of his economic policy preferences, but he became a lot more pro-church, family values, basically conservative socially, left-wing economically. And that ended up being a very successful formula, such that he was able to become president again, I think around 2006 or so. And he's effectively been president. Well, he has been president ever since. And the direction that he's taken has been much more authoritarian. In fact, probably much more authoritarian than he even was in the 1980s, when the US was explicitly trying to overthrow his government. But the US hasn't really cared that much either. From 2006 up until a couple of years ago, the US had been pretty willing to just kind of overlook the whole region in general. Not just Nicaragua, but Central America generally. And it was really only when the immigration issue started up, when there was loads of migrants coming from Central America, that the U.S. government started paying more attention to Central America. But the thing there is that Nicaragua was not really a major source. Like, most of the migrants coming were from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Relatively few were coming from Nicaragua. So even when the U.S. started paying more attention to Central America, we really were not focusing much on Nicaragua even then. So what changed was 2019. I mean, gosh, it's been a long time since 2019, even if it doesn't feel like it. But in 2019, there was a series of protests. Lebanon, Chile, Hong Kong, etc. We talked about them at the time. But among them was Nicaragua. And the Nicaraguan protests had to do with an election that a lot of people expected to not be free and fair, because the Nicaraguan government was going out of its way to arrest and intimidate a number of opposition politicians ahead of the vote. And so that sparked a number of protests against the government, and the government responded relatively violently by trying to put down the protests using pro-government thugs that were working for Ortega's main party. So the result of that is that the US government kind of had to respond to some degree. We couldn't just kind of ignore it outright like we'd been before. So we started putting sanctions on individuals and government, as well as applying diplomatic pressure to try to get the Nicaraguan government to ease up and try to at least pretend like it cared about human rights. So, somewhat ironically, it's kind of a replay of what we did with the Somozas back in the day. We don't really care too much about the region so long as it's relatively quiet. But when you start acting up as a leader, then we kind of have to. So that was more or less the approach the U.S. started taking after 2019 with Ortega in Nicaragua. It was a much more benign approach than the Reagan administration's approach in the 80s. We're not like supporting rebel groups and whatnot like we did back then. But we have had to take a somewhat harder tack diplomatically as a result of the government's explicit shift into authoritarianism. Before they'd been somewhat authoritarian, but they'd allowed civil society space in order to operate. So they could claim to be popular, legitimately popular, and that they were winning relatively free and fair elections. But after 2019, that's no longer the case. Like they really did start to crack down pretty significantly. So it is pretty authoritarian now. It's not as authoritarian as Cuba, or probably not even as much as Venezuela, but it's kind of getting there. So between Ortega being a socialist revolutionary in terms of his political origins, and also leading a government that was explicitly undermined and targeted for regime change by the US government in the 1980s. And then also the fact that he has very poor relations right now with the United States on account of the authoritarianism and crackdowns and whatnot. All of these three factors are the reasons why the Nicaraguan government under Ortega has reached out to governments like the Russian government and the Chinese government and other rivals of the United States to try to get support. Because Ortega himself does not particularly trust the United States government for obvious reasons at this point. And he also, not only that, but really implicitly believes that the US government is going to try to overthrow his government at some point. Again, that has to do with his ideological background. 70s lefty revolutionaries were very, very down on the US government. They saw it as imperialistic and as being driven by a kind of belligerent foreign policy that demanded not just cooperation, but also subjugation. They believed that the CIA was sort of the vanguard of US foreign policy and that they actively tried to overthrow governments that they saw as possibly not just antagonistic, but that could be too left wing in nature. So, that being the case, he just assumes, probably, I guess I can't read his mind, but I imagine he assumes, prima facie, that the US is out to get him. So, that's not a mindset that really lends itself to cooperation. So, between paranoia and a desire, well, because of the paranoia, he's trying to reach out to other partner states that he sees as also rivals of the United States, because he sees them as the only really trustworthy partners that he could really work with. So that's why he voted against. That's why he voted no in the UN resolution you mentioned. That's basically his way of signaling that he's open for cooperation with countries like China or Russia as far as support to him and his regime in Nicaragua. I think it's kind of unnecessary. My critique would be that Ortega could probably cooperate with the United States and get pretty much everything he wants. It's not as though the United States has not supported authoritarian leaders in the region before. I grant that most of them, well, none of them really have been left-wing in nature, but I would point out that that mostly happened during the Cold War, when there was an explicitly left-wing imperial power that we were competing with. I don't get the impression since the Cold War ended that the US really cares that much about the ideological composition of governments in Latin America. Now it's just more about how belligerent are you towards the United States? So long as the answer is not very, the US government will probably just ignore you. So I think Nicaragua could do that, but I get the impression Ortega is just too paranoid, given his personal history with the United States, to do that.
That makes sense. Trying to sum it up, it sort of seems like if you can't be friends with the US, or at least if you're not currently friends with the US, you don't really have that much to lose by picking the other side. It's
Yeah,
more of like you have the potential to gain something by making friends at the other cafeteria table.
pretty much. Yeah, again, it's more of a signal. I don't know that he's actually doing much substantively to assist Russia or, oppose Ukraine,
Hmm.
for example. It's just more of a statement.
Yeah, and that's another thing that we've seen a lot of leaders generally do, not necessarily in a vote like this, but for certain countries that have a bad history with the US, like a good way to just build cred with your base is just like bash the US a little bit. The US is
Yeah.
doing this, we're going to be critical of them. And they're like, yeah, look at them standing up to the US. And you get cred for doing that. So it makes sense.
So hopefully that satisfactorily answers the question. If not, then you can just hit me up on Twitter or something and I can and go into more detail or whatnot. Well, was there something else we wanted to get to?
I don't think I had any items that we needed to cover.
Well, the Brazilian election is coming up. That's going to be exciting.
Yep.
Should
How's
be
it?
pretty close.
It's looking close.
Well, I did have some weird items if you wanted to get to those.
Sure, weird items are funny.
Did you see the video that was released by that guy running for, what was it, the Senate, I think? No, and it wouldn't have been Senate. He's a local politician running for office somewhere in the northeastern US. I forget where, but he released his own sex tape on purpose as part of his campaign ad, right?
What? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So his deal is that he thinks that sex work should be legal.
Okay.
And so, in order to signal his support for that, he had sex with an escort, videotaped it, and then has now released the video online.
Okay.
Pretty bold strategy.
Yeah, we'll see if it pans out.
Yeah, I'm not sure what district he's running in. Maybe that sort of thing is more popular there. But otherwise, I think he might have pushed it too far. I don't know. I don't know that rank and file voters are necessarily going to be for that. Let's see. Another item here. Did you see the massacre of children in Thailand?
No.
Yeah, there was a guy who entered like what was it? I think it was a daycare or something. And then he started shooting and stabbing kids and workers there. I think he ended up killing like 22
What the
before he
hell?
got put down. Yeah, it seems like it was just some crazy guy. I don't think there was like a real motive behind it per se. He just kind of lost his shit.
Weird.
Yeah. And then did you see the what was it? Oh yeah, the C have you heard of Beyond Meat?
Yes.
So the CEO of that company was fired after a biting incident at a football game. Apparently there was some kind of altercation and he bit somebody on the nose.
What?
Yeah.
Why?
The jokes write themselves, Neuro. Needs real meat. Couldn't control himself anymore.
He attacks someone by biting them. That's an old school way of doing things. Okay.
Well, those football fans, they just don't know how to control themselves.
Are we talking about football or soccer?
American football.
Okay.
I think it was a college football game.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. What else did we have here? Oh yeah, there was that cult, I guess, in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a Jewish group called Lev Tahor, which apparently is Hebrew for pure of heart. It was formed in Israel in 1988, has about 350 members, and it's actually kind of spread out amongst different countries: Israel, the US, Macedonia, Morocco, Mexico, and Guatemala. The Israelis, for their part, I should say the Israeli government apparently sees them as being a cult. There was apparently a Israeli court that ruled that it was a quote unquote dangerous cult. So I don't get the impression they're particularly welcome in Israel, which is why I think they've been fanning out into these other countries here. Some of the things they do are basically just fundamentalist Jewish type stuff. So child marriage, harsh punishments, even for minor transgressions. And then women and girls as young as 3 years old have to completely cover up with robes.
Hmm.
So, fundamentalist religion type of stuff. Nothing too out of the ordinary as far as that goes. And let's see. So basically, there was a leak. Somebody who was part of the cult in Mexico uh, informed on them to the police that there were people that were being held at the compound that the group owned against their will. And so the police raided it and arrested a bunch of people. And so that's how I ended up reading about it. There was a big brouhaha about, religious freedom and this cult and, some of the weirder things they were doing. there was a little more to the story. The people that were arrested were actually able to break out of jail and escape, weirdly. So those people have been on the run ever since. Presumably they're out of country by now. But yeah, Jewish cults in Mexico shut down, but then the people arrested escaped from jail. Apparently they just overwhelmed the guards. They just kind of jumped them and then busted out. It's not the most sophisticated jailbreak, you might say.
Damn. And stories you didn't expect to hear this week.
Yeah, we did have some new export controls. This isn't weird per se, but it was on my list of stuff. But there's some new export controls that the Biden administration has implemented, specifically targeting China. Yeah, it's kind of a step forward for them. The Biden administration has been, famously deliberating on what its China trade strategy should be, and they just kind of haven't been able to figure it out yet, even though we're, what, 1 year, almost 2 years into the administration now, and they're still kind of waffling on it. But I think last week or so they finally released a new set of export controls, which kind of suggests that they're going to kind of focus more on holding back China's tech sector. They still don't really have a strategy per se, but the specific measures outlined kind of suggest that we're not going to just focus on stopping Chinese chip producers from buying the most advanced chip making equipment and otherwise trying to inhibit the flow of new technology there. Now we're going to explicitly go out of our way to try to prevent even just advanced chips in general from being sold there, as well as prohibiting software and capital equipment from being sold there. That's at least of an advanced enough nature. It's not necessarily complete cutoff of tech equipment, specifically relevant to semiconductors, to China. There has been some effect in that vein thus far. A lot of people have been pulling out of the market, and there's borderline panic amongst some people in the industry in China. But the reality is that there probably still will be some trade there. It's not meant to be a complete cutoff. They're just trying to be more specific and intrusive as far as to the restrictions in place. They've expanded them to new areas and made them deeper and more in depth, so that they can be more impactful on the industry writ large, rather than just trying to deny specific technologies like they were doing before. But there will still be, technology exchanged. The market will continue. Licenses will be granted, most likely, but on a much more limited basis. And the bar to get licenses should be higher going forward. I think one of the weirder aspects of it is the personnel rules. I hadn't heard about those before today. So basically, if you're a US citizen, then you are prohibited from engaging, well, basically handling, in the process of working for a Chinese firm in China, any kind of sensitive technology, specifically semiconductors. And it doesn't even have to be technology that is explicitly prohibited or for which you lack a license. It can even just be technology that is nominally allowed to be sold to China and Chinese firms, but which is destined for an end use, which is prohibited. That was another thing that the Biden administration changed. It significantly expanded the range of end uses that given goods are prohibited from being sold for. So, if you're selling something that's not really that advanced, but it's going to be used for an end use by a Chinese firm that is prohibited, like, say, building a supercomputer or being used to eventually build and export encrypted technological apps of one kind or another, or for something like a WMD, weirdly, that's all prohibited. So, even in those cases, you won't be able to sell the technology, even if the technology is not that advanced. So it just basically raises the bar in general. And that's still not much of a strategy, but it's still more than what was being done before. I think the only critique I would have of it, the major critique I would have is that they haven't, I feel, done enough to really involve third-party countries yet. Because the trouble with bilateral actions like this is that while they'll significantly impact trade relations and the flow of technology to and fro China and the United States, It's still going to be possible for third-party countries to act as hosts, basically, for Chinese firms trying to get around these kinds of measures. And I don't have doubt that Chinese firms and certainly the Chinese government are going to be very proactive in trying to do that. So I think in order for these measures to really be airtight, we're going to need to cooperate a lot more with partners, especially partners in Europe and then also the Far East, since those are the main markets where we were already kind of selling these kinds of technologies and equipment to. That makes it relatively easy for Chinese to set up front operations in places like that to try to get the technologies that they're prohibited from getting. If they tried to set it up in like Africa or in another developing country that doesn't really have a tech industry, it's a little more obvious. It's kind of easier to check those on the part of the US government, but there are so many buyers and the market is so large in East Asia and Europe that makes it more attractive to set up as a third-party host for a front company of some kind. So probably there's going to be a lot of evasion here on the part of the Chinese for a while until the United States can actually construct a larger architecture of international cooperation on export controls. They kind of tried to get around that by using the foreign product rule, but that's only going to get you so far. The foreign product rule basically says that even if you're not a US company, if you're a company that is a foreign company, but which is using US produced goods as an input for whatever it is you're producing, then you still require a license to sell that stuff, whatever it is you're making, uh, onto, say, a prohibited buyer, be it a Chinese buyer or some other kind of buyer whom is prohibited under rules outlined in US export controls, which technically is a form of extraterritoriality, which is not popular amongst foreign governments, but because the US still exports a lot of stuff that do comprise critical inputs for the production of a lot of stuff, by different firms around the world, the foreign product rule is actually fairly effective. So foreign firms will find it relatively difficult if they don't want to be sanctioned and basically lose access to their suppliers to act as front companies for the Chinese government or Chinese firms. The issue is more Chinese actors basically setting up whole new actors and then trying to use the fact that those actors will be unknown and will not be listed, say, on the Commerce Department's entities list, and to use that fact to try to get around sanctions and license restrictions, export restrictions, what have you. It could be that the surveillance regime that the US sets up to try to enforce all this stuff is sufficiently strong to catch that. But I'm a little skeptical. The global market is just so massive that it'll be really difficult to do that without third-party cooperation. And I don't know that there is really sufficient such enforcement in some of the smaller developing countries like, say, Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea to a lesser degree, what have you, in order to really have this work fully. So it will have an impact. It's going to inhibit operations in a lot of tech firms in China, but they're going to try to undermine it every way they can. And I think they'll probably be able to make good progress on that in the short term, at least.
If you use our products, you must swear to use them for good and not for evil, otherwise we'll be very upset with you. Okay.
So some progress there, but incomplete. We still need kind of an overarching strategy. Thus far, the only real strategy I've heard from either the Trump administration or the Biden administration is that we need to try to maintain at least one or two generations technological lead over China's chip producers.
Mm-hmm.
That's considered necessary in order to maintain a significant enough advantage in the market to maintain what you might call the national security interests. Basically, we're concerned that if they're at par or more advanced than us, then they'll be able to do stuff that we won't really have a defense against. They'll
Mm-hmm.
have enough economic influence to get other countries to do stuff that they don't want to do and that we don't want them to do. But then they'll also be able to get technology that's more advanced than us in the defense sphere, which would be bad news for any potential military conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So maintaining a generational lead is the only thing that any administration has really outlined as a viable objective. Beyond that, other areas of Chinese influence, like Chinese investment in other countries, the size of Chinese exports, stuff like that. Still no real plan there. I haven't even really heard a viable plan as far as stuff like dependence on Chinese exports of rare earth materials, for example. There has been some progress on that, but no real overarching strategy. It's just been policy on that front has been very reactive and it's been very incremental. There's policy meetings held by this, that, or the other administrative agency, and occasionally there's some kind of meeting held with foreign states to try to coordinate policy, but there's still nothing systematic. It's just kind of just spotty, you might say.
There's not a clear vision for what our policy is.
Yeah, yeah. China, the potential threat that China poses, not just in the fact that it's controlled by an authoritarian, political party, but also the fact that the size of its economy inherently gives it a lot of heft in the world and is going to give that authoritarian political party a lot of options as far as what the state of China can do. There hasn't really been a systematic study of the challenges that that development poses. And because that systematic review has not happened, we cannot really have a systematic understanding of all of the threats and challenges that China poses now and will pose in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So we would really need something more thorough in terms of public policy in order to really deal with this challenge. But as of now, like we can't even fully conceptualize it, let alone come up with like a full range of policies to deal with it. So that's something that really needs to change. But no administration yet has really endeavored to really do that. To be fair, it's a big job.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, China's economy is so large and the level of integration between it and the rest of the world, including the United States, is so high that having a thorough review of all of those connections and all of the implications of China's economic development would be very, very difficult. But it has to be done. Like, there's no way around it. Like, you have to look at that to try to find all of the points of vulnerability, right? The bottlenecks in global trade, because those bottlenecks are really what gives them a lot of influence. Those are points of leverage for the party. And if we can't identify them beforehand, then we're going to have to identify them after they become an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be fatal, depending. How's that?
It's pretty good. We're at a reasonable stopping point. Chat's bantering a little bit about First Amendment, free speech, Alex Jones getting into trouble, that kind of thing. He's definitely a character who just says all kinds of crap at a very rapid pace, which can get you into trouble. And there was the whole like Sandy Hook trials and things like that, and declaring bankruptcy and that sort of a thing, which a lot of the discussion around situations like this point to accountability for your communication, especially when it comes to different private companies banning you from their platforms, Twitter banning people from things like that. And then for the example here, we have Twitch chat, and I try to be a balanced broadcaster where I welcome in people to the conversation, and you can come into the conversation a little bit hot, maybe with a little bit of a strong opinion, maybe you're a little bit abrasive, and channeling the energy of Kukio to be able to welcome someone in and ask them questions or try to understand their perspective and where they're coming from, rather than to just immediately take the opposing side and then get into an argument with them. We have had quite a few viewers who will show up, say some shit, but then calm down. Earlier in the Agent Smith discussion today, after I asked the question about Bulgaria, there was a debate about who invented the Cyrillic alphabet that actually went on for about an hour, just between two people. And a bunch of other people in the chat were like, guys, just agree to disagree and move on. Like, no one else is talking about this at this point. We were well on to talking about Spain and like the Americas and all kinds of other stuff. But yeah, it's interesting figuring out like how do you communicate well given the situation that you're in? What freedoms do we have for our ability to communicate? But also, where is it good to moderate those types of communication? It's It's an interesting world that we live in with a bunch of different spaces to communicate and different rules. Back in the day, speaking in the town square was the only place that you could speak, and then you have writing systems and things like that that were developed, and people police what you can write about. But yeah, we're in a very interesting time.
Yeah, every new age of technological development comes with it new political problems.
Mm-hmm.
So moderation on the internet is certainly one of the big ones in the current era.
Absolutely. There is a breaking news thing 1 hour ago on BBC. There was Chinese staff that pulled a protester inside of their Great Britain consulate and beat him up. Is that not considered a cross-border abduction? Well, I would say it sounds like a pretty tough day for whoever got beaten up. But I haven't seen this report yet in question.
Well, if they're a Chinese citizen, it's a little different. I mean, I don't think the British government would react differently. They'll still be very, very outraged, but
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, the Chinese government has been a lot more brazen about dealing with dissidents that are Chinese citizens than otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that'll be a diplomatic incident.
Yep.
That'll do the trick.
Waiting for the headline. Britain warns. Britain warns China. Oh no, they've been warned. They've issued a warning. There's so many warnings that get issued. You get desensitized when you get warned 100 times every week.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately. So gives you an appreciation for the quiet days back in the 90s and aughts.
Yeah. Yeah, the 90s was a weirdly quiet time. I think for a lot of people, they would have thought that, oh, civilization just reached this point of peace and slow internet together and weird khaki pants and huge glasses, but it wasn't here to stay.
Oh,
That was just a lull. We'll probably get another lull in terms of like aggression and change at some point. It's certainly not now.
no.
Maybe in the 30s.
Yeah, you may have to wait a while.
Yeah, maybe in the 40s.
I'm sure there were people in the 1920s who were hoping that after World War I, they were entering a period of quiet.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Actually, I have bad news for you. It's going to get way worse.
Yeah, history is pretty merciless.
Yep.
Just gotta hang in there, I guess.
Yep. Well, appreciate you coming on as always, and thank you, chat, for your participation and your enthusiasm. Even if it gets spicy at times, I'll publish this VOD after we wrap the stream so you can read the chat. And we should see you on the next episode. I should be good to go for the next 2 weeks, and then I'm going to go visit family, so I'll miss the next one.
No problem.
Appreciate you coming on. Don't forget your 20-minute walk, and we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.